All right. Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today I have Tim Howard here. We are going to be doing a comprehensive response to Sean Carroll's lecture that he did, I think, like 9 years ago. And the topic is, basically the title of the video is "God is not a good theory." And I'll share my screen so that people can see which video I'm talking about. So it's this one. I don't know if you've seen it on the internet, but has how many views? 1.3 million views. So it's let's just say that it's had a pretty big influence on people. It seems like definitely not your normal kind of video, because most videos on the philosophy of religion don't get this many views. So we think that we feel like a lot of the arguments that some atheists use, not all, but some atheists have used, I actually referenced what he's saying here, so we'll get into that. But before we get into that, how you doing, Tim?
Doing pretty good. Yeah, I'm pretty excited to respond to this. We've been itching to kind of make a response to this for a while. I wanted to ever since I found Swinburne, I wanted to give my thoughts on this video. So it's been a long time coming, and really what we're going to be doing is we're going to be really addressing the ideas behind this. And we're not at all like attacking him as a person and whatnot, or him as a credentialed person or whatnot, but we're going after the philosophy. We're going after and exposing where do we differ in this, and what are some of the things that Colin and I both have discovered over time in the philosophy of religion that we think are being missed in this presentation here. And then we can clear up a lot of things, because I know that some people think that this is a really good go-to demonstration for why theism is not a good theory. And if there is at least a video response to it, I think we're going to be doing our due diligence and representing the other side of critiquing the ideas presented in this video, because I think that a lot of the ideas presented in this video are ideas that a lot of people online like to parrot. They like to regurgitate these ideas as well. They think that they are, well, at least they're presented in a way, in a very congratulatory way, that they are irrefutable, right? And we're going to show that, people can rationally disagree with the points that Sean Carroll brings up in this presentation.
Yeah, because I'm not gonna. I mean, I know he's a physicist. I'm not gonna criticize him on his physics or anything. So this is all philosophy. And me and Tim, we've studied the philosophy of religion for many years. So, and a lot of people, we've talked to a lot of atheists online. So I think me and Tim are, and also I'm also I'm getting my bachelor's in philosophy within the next few years. So I feel I have the credentials somewhat to speak on this. And then Tim is well read. So hopefully we'll be able to get through this, is what I'm saying. But yeah. Anyways, with that in mind, let's get started. No, sorry. There we go.
By a simple scientific theory, but there are also aspects of the idea of God that do play the roles of a scientific theory, and those aspects can be judged by the same criteria that we use to judge theories. In the original schedule, if you have seen that, it removed the word good from my title, so it just said God is not a theory, but that is the opposite of what I'm trying to say here. So just so you know my point of view, I'm saying that God is a theory. The idea of God, to the extent that almost all believers use the idea of God, does have aspects of it that can be judged in precisely analogous ways to the way that we judge an ordinary scientific theory. Now, I'm very well aware there is a thread of thought that says the opposite of that. It says that the idea of God is something separate, it's a different kind of idea than the ideas that we use when we have physics theories. So, God is not reproducible or something like that. So I just want to get around that particular definitional problem by...
Yep.
So, okay, so I mean, he's right that God is a theory. I'm glad he thinks that. I think obviously where we're going to differ is that God is, or theism, right, as we say it, is exactly that of a physics theory. That's where we're going to disagree. But I'm glad that he's on the page with saying it's a theory, because because I've been on TikTok too much. There are people that love to say that God isn't even a theory at all. So at least we're at that point with this.
No, yeah, and the other thing is, he's going to talk about multiverse and stuff. And I guess one of the first things before we get, well, I'm going to just wait and see if he makes any claims in regards to if theism is exactly like a scientific theory, because I think if he's going to make that claim, that's going to be inconsistent with what he says later in the video. But anyways, let's continue on. But yeah, I mean, I do agree with Sean Carroll that theism is a theory in the sense that theism is a story or a narrative we tell to explain phenomena. Right. If we mean by theory in that sense, then I agree with Sean Carroll. But if we mean theory in a different sense, like a physics sense, then no, that's where we're going to differ. But yeah, anyways.
Putting forward the idea of theory is something very, very broad. I don't want to pick some very, very specific philosophy of science definition of a theory. To me, a theory is just an idea about the universe that may be true or false.
What's your thought about? What's your thoughts on that, Tim?
Maybe true or false.
That seems kind of interesting. I don't know if I would agree with that definition of a theory. So I would take.
So basically, what he's saying is, well, an idea about the universe may be true. I mean, that's just a proposition about space-time, right?
Yep. Yeah.
I have some proposition about space-time, and propositions and that's implied that it could be true or false. And so what I like about this, the value in this is, yeah, we want to leave it broad, right? Because we want to say that a theory is something that that weaves many strands of data together into one kind of coherent narrative that tells a story about either the history of the data or something that's supposed to give us an illuminating picture into when all the data is taken together, what that means, right? So that's that whole kind of narrative understanding, right? This is the view that Trent Doherty takes in his work when he's understanding theism as a theory, right? It's a narrative about certain facts.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I was gonna say, like, the way that I would understand a theory is just a narrative, right?
Yeah,
that you tell, story you tell.
I'm fine with a proposition about space-time, or maybe a proposition meant to explain, let's say, the universe, right?
Yep.
And however you want to define that.
Now, what's interesting is later in the video, he's going to talk about explanation, and he's going to think, well, it needs to be a physical explanation, and obviously that's going to be controversial. But anyways, but yeah, I mean, other than that, I mean, I guess I'll grant him this point. There's not really much to disagree with.
Try to figure out how to judge whether or not this particular idea is true or false. So one of the problems with God as a theory is that it is not a very precisely specified theory. That is going to be one of my points, is that even though we sometimes try to have God play the role of a physical theory, making predictions and explaining things, serving some explanatory role, I'm going to argue that it doesn't do a very good job. Now, again, I will, even though I'm not a trained theologian, I certainly know that we have different conceptions of God. In fact, this is what I would argue is one of the check marks against God as a very good theory, is that if you try to say, well,
yeah. I mean, but wouldn't that work for physics as well, right? I mean,
yeah.
I mean, let's just take different conceptions of God, models of God, and let's just look at that as interpretations, and let's just go look at quantum mechanics, and let's just go take those as interpretations or models of physics, right? There are all these differing models of physics about quantum mechanics, about measurement, about quantum gravity. Well, I guess that's just a black mark on quantum theory. Then, well, no.
Well, I mean, quantum mechanics, they have like 15 different interpretations.
Well, right. I mean, yeah. I mean, you have string theorists. You have you have people like Carroll going after the emergent space-time idea. You have loop quantum gravity, right? You have what's the other one? Like Leonard Susskind's view. You have people doing different, having different fields of inquiry, being funded to look into different things, or how to explain something like quantum gravity, or how to unify the two regimes, right? Classical and quantum. And
yeah,
I mean, I don't see that as being a black mark on the theory. I think that's actually like, I think that depending on who you're talking to, right?
That might be good to have multiple different models of God or whatever. Especially when you, well, not only that, but also consider like, okay, even if you have like some implausible models of theism, that doesn't mean that therefore theism as a whole is implausible. There are certain versions of theism that I don't accept, that I think are implausible, but that doesn't mean that therefore the probability of theism overall as the genus theory
Right.
is less probable. So I think that's another distinction we want to make, is a distinction between theism as a genus theory versus theism as a species theory. So you can have multiple species, more different kinds of theisms, right? And each one's going to have a different conception, right? But that's not going to therefore decrease just because one of them may be shown to be incorrect, does that mean that therefore the genus is incorrect? So I just want to point that out. But
yeah. I'm glad you pointed out, because I was thinking about that just now, because it's this idea, right, that you have theism as the genus, and then it branches out into these different species, and the species represent the different conceptions or formulations of either what God is, or how God explains data, right? And I mean, Swinburne says this, right? Swinburne says that theism makes its predictions on the nature of the God posited, right? And so you can cash this out in terms of probability, because we are probabilists in our evidentialist epistemology here. We're going to say that, okay, he wants to say that the genus theism itself is going to lose probability just simply for having different species of theism, right? Rather than saying, well, these theisms over here don't actually do the work that I'm wanting to do, lacking predictive power, right? And so it's going to take on that, right? I mean, but not even looking at intrinsic probability, right? Because if we are going to examine a theory, we're going to look at its intrinsic probability and its explanatory power. And so maybe he's saying that right out the gate, its intrinsic probability takes a hit because there are all these different species of God. And again, it goes back to my other point. You can take the same thing with quantum mechanics. You can say there's a genus like quantum theory, quantum mechanics, and the different species of that, and we can rule out interpretations. So I think it works in the same way here, and I think that if that sense, then using Rasmussen's kind of language of bring on the bridge of reason, right? We can invite Carroll onto the bridge of reason, because his own view, right? He's trying to work on a view of quantum theory that does this unificatory work, right? He wants to show that it's not a lost project, because, well, of course, there's going to be some truth somewhere, right? I mean, we could say the landscape's infinite, right? Like there's an infinite species branching off from the genus, and eventually we're going to find the true one, right? So we can, I think that's what Carroll's even doing in his own work. So we can invite him onto the bridge with us and say, yeah, we're doing the same thing.
Well, another point I want to make is, I know Sean Carroll's a cosmologist, and I know that he does study like these different models of how the universe came about, right? He has his own models, and he's said that there's different, even like in his debate with Lynn Lane Craig, he mentioned how there are these different models of how the universe came about. Okay, well, right. And he says, well, we know that some of the models are wrong and we don't know about others. It's like, dude, you're does that mean that therefore because some models are wrong, then therefore cosmology is wrong? No.
Right.
Trying to find the best model, right? Just because there's some models that are, don't work, right, for whatever reason. I'm not a cosmologist, but I know he's said that some of them don't work. And so if some of them don't work for whatever reason, it doesn't therefore decrease the probability of cosmology, because some of the models in cosmology don't work. So I can't, if that's true for cosmology, then why can't the same be true for theism? Right. So
very true.
Anyways, let's continue.
Here's why I don't believe in God. Someone else will say, you just don't understand what God is. God is completely different than that. And I recognize that. I will try to at least explain which versions of God I am talking about. I can't guarantee they are your favorite versions of God. So we can pick out three. It's not an exclusive list: passive, active, and emergent conceptions of God. And what I mean by this under passive is the kind of roles that are given to God going back to some of the ancient Greeks, going back at least to Aristotle, a sort of philosophical role for God as something that helps explain, helps sustain the universe. An unmoved mover, a first cause, a necessary being, various philosophical notions that are not necessarily empirical in the same way that scientific theories are. This kind of God is one that just is something that we need in this conception to make sense of the universe, not something that necessarily is going around poking around in the universe and intervening it and changing the physical laws. The active conception of God is a more personal idea. Often people will define God as a kind of person. Just as often they will say that God is not a person. But there's this conception of God as someone who cares about life here on earth, cares about human beings, cares both in the sense that, he wants us to succeed, but also sometimes he judges us, and sometimes a little harshly. It depends on how far you want to go, but God will pass down moral guidance, will set up an afterlife for you that you'll be sorted once you die, and so forth. There's various uses that this sort of more active God has to perform. And finally, there's what I like to call an emergent idea of God, which is to say that God not as a fundamental category, but God as a way of talking about aspects of the universe that you could also choose to talk about in different ways. God is the laws of nature. God is the orderliness of the cosmos. God is the universe itself, or God is love, or God is our feeling of awe and transcendence as we approach the universe. And these different conceptions of God have different justifications for them. The passive notion of God just in the background can be attempted to be justified on purely logical grounds, just by thinking about how the universe might be. The more active conception of God is going to be essentially an empirical argument, that the best way to explain the universe we see is to imagine that God is doing these things in an active sense. Whereas the emergent idea of God is a more rhetorical move. And I don't mean that in any disparaging way. It's a way of talking about the universe that we see. So I'm actually not going to be talking about this third category. My personal belief, for those of you who are fascinated by it, is that I don't see any need to talk about the universe in that vocabulary. But if you want to, I won't stop you. What I'm more interested in for the purposes of this talk are the conceptions of God that introduce God as a separate metaphysical category that we have something to do with. And I'll start with these more philosophical, metaphysical arguments in favor of God. I think that as a scientist, the second category is more relevant, but I do have to get this one out of the way before we can move on to the second one. So what does it mean, and what is the role played by God as an unmoved mover, as an Aristotelian first cause, God as a necessary being? Very often, if you ask theologians, how would the universe be different if God did not exist? They will say, I cannot imagine a universe in which God does not exist, therefore I cannot answer that question. To me, as a scientist, there's a huge problem right from the start with this kind of reasoning, which is that the whole strategy is one based on some a priori metaphysics. That is to say, this is very much armchair philosophizing in the best sense of the word, sitting down, thinking about all the possible ways the world can be, and concluding that those ways must somehow involve the idea of God. There's no step in that process in which you actually go out and look at how the universe actually is. You don't need to in this way of thinking about it, because you can just argue logically that God must be part of the universe. It is my firm belief.
Okay, so there's a lot of things kind of being just thrown here, right? Like my mind was catching on to a lot of things. I'm like, okay, are we talking about modality now? Are we talking about rationalism versus empiricism? Are we talking about going out and retrodicting now, like everything? So I'm going. I guess we can just kind of go back and forth on this kind of openly about our thoughts. But I think it's interesting because I think I don't know too many theistic philosophers these days that would argue that God is a priori. God must logically exist.
Well, yeah, I mean, not so. Okay, so with the exception of, the closest you might get is something like Alvin Plantinga's work on God being properly basic, but that's an epistemic thing and not necessarily an argument.
Right, exactly.
Right. So if we're making an argument for theism, I'm not really aware of any arguments that try to show that God logically has to exist, right?
Right.
Typically, you're going to see in the literature, you're going to see arguments for that God is a necessary being. So, like for example, I forgot the author of the paper, but there's a paper called "From Necessary Being to God," and what the author argues is basically that
is that Rasmussen's paper, or is that somebody else's? Okay,
somebody else's. So they use an abductive argument where, okay, well, if we grant that there is a necessary being, then the best explanation for that being's necessity is that it's perfect. Now, yes, that's an a priori argument, but you're still using abductive reasoning. It's not like all deductive and
Oh,
that
is
kind
that
of
Byerly's paper?
Varley's, yeah, that was the author. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also considerations. I know Rasmussen has an argument from limits, right? But that's not necessarily like I think this debate about rationalism, empiricism, is really depending on how you define them. I don't really see the tension between them because, like, for example, like in order to like have empirical knowledge, you kind of like have to use your reason to like form thoughts about what you're seeing, whatever it might be,
Right.
and then vice versa. In order to reason, you have to have some prior concepts that you gain from
Right.
from your empirical knowledge, right?
So I
So
think the empiricist
don't
would say at this point, right? Like
Yeah.
what I understand the empiricist line of thought is that our reasoning that you're talking about is really just for organizing thoughts. And so like we take in these observations and it's really just like an organizational kind of tool, but it isn't something that's like able to probe the depths of, I guess, unobservable reality in that sense. Like that's kind of the impression that I get, right? Is that
Yeah.
instead of being able to think and go, okay, are there such things as moral facts? You know, is aesthetic realism true? Like these different kinds of ideas. What types of objects are there, right? I think that they think that role of the mind doesn't. I don't even want to say like that the mind doesn't play that role. The mind plays a very specific role. It's like an organizational one. And so like that's going to be a big difference because if we're going to be arguing when it comes to theism, which is fundamentally a metaphysical theory of reality, right? Well, then there's this idea that we are doing a very specific kind of metaphysics, and a lot of metaphysics is going to be grounded in a rationalist paradigm rather than an empiricist paradigm. And so I think that that's going to be something that, well, obviously Sean is doing metaphysics, is going to be doing metaphysics in this entire presentation here. So I feel like I see what you're saying. Like it's going to be very hard to not dip your toes in the rationalist waters in trying to discuss things like this or just trying to discuss things in general. And so, but I feel as though that this discussion about theism, like God existing, not existing, is going to be inherently a rationalist endeavor, right? We're going to be having we're going to have to be thinking in very abstract ways, not just ways in which we make sense of things that we observe, but we're going to have to make sense of ideas that, if true, right, within our epistemology, if
right.
true, do actually reflect or say something about reality. So I think that that's something interesting just when it comes to the rationalist versus empiricist endeavors, or else we're just going to have a difference in an epistemology here, right? We're going to have to just kind of go our separate ways. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that in this kind of conversation, like if the rationalists and the empiricists are talking to one another, and the rationalist says, "Hey, no, I truly believe that the light of reason reveals reality," and the empiricist says, "No, it just helps us better understand that which we obtain through our senses." Do you think that that's going to be a something that's going to be a barrier to having this kind of truth-seeking conversation?
In the sense that if we're using non-empirical arguments for theism, then yeah. So like necessary existence, like that's not, you can't show that empirically, right? Same thing with like moral truths. Like you can't show that God is the good, right? That's just known from the definition of theism, right? So it's kind of a tautology,
Yeah.
right? So because of that, it's gonna be, it really depends on the argument, first of all, and I would generally agree with you that like I feel like Sean Carroll is going off of a different, I don't know what his epistemology is. So like I don't know if he's a coherentist or a foundationalist. He does mention Bayes' theorem, so maybe he's a Bayesian. I don't know. But yeah, that's gonna be a big, I guess, disagreement, right?
You know, and I kind of like this idea, kind of going off what you're saying, which is like you know, I think we want to keep Sean on the bridge of reason as much as possible, right? Because we're Swinburnians, right? We appreciate the fact that what Swinburne did is he took the logic of science and he just situated it within a metaphysical context. You know,
Yeah.
is God more probable than its negation? That kind of context. And if that's the case, right, then if we're applying the logic of science to this idea of whether or not this metaphysical theory is true, right, then I think that we can keep Carroll on the bridge of reason with us still, because what we can do in that sense is we can say, yeah, I completely agree with you. I think we should be applying this logic of science, right? I feel like we should go out and collect data. We should go look at data, like test the predictive power of theism, right, and see if it actually works out. So I think that that's ultimately good, because I think that what he's worried about is like, well, if I could just sit here and go, yeah, I can just logically show and demonstrate that God exists, and there's no data that can ever change that proposition, then I'll go, okay, yeah. One, I think most states would agree.
Yep.
If you have a counter argument, right? So there's room for counter argument, right? There's room for rebutting defeaters, right? And that's the work of people like Paul Draper.
So basically, what you're saying, Tim, is like, we want to use induction rather than deduction.
yeah, we would prefer to be on that on that part with Carroll. Exactly, we prefer to inductively assess this using an inductive criteria proposed by Swinburne: background knowledge, scope, simplicity, predictive power. But at the same time, there's also room for counter arguments in terms of arguments for, is this proposition coherent, or what's the evidence against the proposition? Rebutting defeaters. Paul Draper is doing that, right? He's proposed alternative evidence. So I agree. It's like, I think that theism is vulnerable, like all other theories, to particular observations. And so I think that he would agree with us, like, okay, yeah, like we can use an inductive criteria to examine theism, and it's not just going to be this idea of, well, I come up with some way to show that God logically exists, and so there's nothing that we don't even need to look at the world. And we're like, yeah, we don't prefer to argue that way either. So I think we're with Carroll on that part.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. So basically, it's like you don't want all your arguments to be a priori, because then, like, you can't be a Swinburnian in that case, right? Well, not only that, but like you can't even address, like, you're not going to be able to use like Bayes' theorem, because then you're not talking about probabilities. You're talking like, oh no, this has to be true or false. Basically, like there's no in between, right? So in that case, yeah, I don't think we should go that route. So yeah. Anyways, let's continue.
This kind of reasoning has never taught us anything true and interesting about the actual world. That is not to say that armchair thinking without going out and looking at the world is not useful in any way. It's extremely useful. Mathematics, logic, other branches of philosophy and formal inquiry are not empirical in nature. They don't involve going out and looking at the actual world. They reason in an a priori sense, but they also don't reveal interesting truths about the actual world.
Right.
What
So
does he mean by that? Interesting truths about the actual world.
So I guess he means like an empirical, in the empirical sense, it doesn't reveal.
So I can't. I can't think and then basically I find a particle the next minute or something like that.
Yeah. Now what's interesting is, like, I actually think that you can. So like he brought up mathematics. There's a lot of mathematics that like you can't do empiricism. Like it's all like you gotta like, in like, for example, you have Gödel's incompleteness theorem. That was something that was discovered through math, something new we didn't know about, right? So like there are examples like in a priori thinking that you can discover, right? But what you're discovering is within that domain. So like mathematics, right? You're discovering that within that domain. You're not. So in that sense, I agree with Sean Carroll in the sense that you're not discovering something new about the observable world just by thinking about it, but you are discovering something new within the paradigm or within the domain of whatever you're working with, right? So that's all I have to say.
Well, what I see what you're saying here is that, he says you're learning nothing interesting about reality, and so or about the world, right? And so for me, first thing I go, okay, when I think of world, I'm thinking about it really in the philosophical sense of world, which is maybe either some mereological sum of states of affairs, right? The totality of states of affairs. You know, there are different definitions of possible worlds, right? There's the idea that it's a maximum description.
Sorry, I didn't. That was. I stopped at a bad time. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay, you're good.
Yeah.
A maximum description of all the ways that reality could be, et cetera, and so forth. And so when I think of world, really what I'm thinking of is like reality. And then when I think of reality, right? Well, I think that there are that we can't, like, there's obviously like observable reality, right? There's observable reality, the mundane objects that we exist, the middle-sized objects that we are dealing with every single day, and then there's the very objects that are very small that particle physicists deal with, cosmologists deal with, etc. And that's perfectly fine. But then I think that, you know, like truths contained in reality inside that bubble, the totality, exists also alongside of the observables, right? And so for me, it's like, well, those are interesting too, right? Like what we're talking about, you know, are there necessary moral truths, right? That's a very thing. Like if that's,
Yeah.
if there's good reason to believe that, right? If that truly does have epistemic purchase, then I think that we have discovered something interesting about reality, even though it's not something that we can observe. But and I like Rasmussen's idea about this, which is that there are different windows into reality. And so we can kind of do like a type tokens thing still here, right? And you know I love doing that, which is
Yeah.
like, well, which is like we have more than one sense. So we can say like our sense are our windows into reality, like that's the type. But then it branches off into tokens in different ways, right? So there's there's you know our perceptual realities, right? That allows us to do science, right? That allows us to discover interesting things about the observable world. But then there's other windows into realities. There's window into the moral fabric of reality. There's window into the mathematical fabric, things that just reason reveals alone, right? And I think that that's all encompassed in the world, reality. And so I think that anything that's discovered that way, those are also interesting things we discover about reality. So I think that discriminating the sentence, it doesn't give us anything interesting about reality, especially because you just brought up Gödel's incompleteness theorem as just a great counterexample, right? I mean, I encourage anybody to just go take some time studying that for themselves, right? You're going to be hard pressed to go away going, that's really inconsequential. Well, it's obviously not inconsequential. It's not even, scientists will tell you it's not inconsequential. And so I feel like in this sense, it's like, do the mathematicians not think that they're discovering anything interesting about reality, right? When they're doing their mathematics, you know, especially like, it's just interesting to me. You know, are we discovering anything interesting about reality, even when we're doing things like art, right? Is there anything aesthetically interesting to discover about reality, either about the human sense? You know, we can keep doing this, and I think that privileging one aspect or one domain of reality, the observable, is kicking too many people off of the bridge of reason, when they would basically, you know, stay in the way that they're doing, well, the way that they would normally. So I think that's a point that would need to be discussed even further, like in a more of a back and forth conversation. Like I'd like to hear like why Sean would only take that route. So I think that's just really interesting.
Yeah. All right.
Reveal interesting truths about the actual world. Mathematics reveals consequences of axioms. You say, I have a certain axiomatic structure and I derive theorems on the basis of that. It doesn't tell you which axioms are possibly true. If you want to actually figure out our universe, does it involve some notion of God? That is an actual fact about the specific universe in which we live. And I personally don't think that this a priori kind of reasoning is ever going to get us there. But let me take it seriously for just a little bit and sort of give you my feelings as a scientist about this. How would we refute the claim that God is a necessary being, for example? And I should also admit that I'm happily conflating all sorts of ultimately different kinds of a priori metaphysical arguments: first cause, prime mover, necessary being. These are all subtly different in ways that I'm going to completely ignore. So sorry about that. They have a similar flavor, and I'm going to treat them similarly. So if you did believe that God was a necessary being, that you literally could not imagine a universe in which God did not play an important role, in order logically for me to refute that belief, All I need to do is to invent a universe in which God does not exist. You know, if you say that all swans are white as a logical fact, all I need to do is show you one black swan to show that your logical argument can't be right. So all we need to do is invent a universe that God does not play a role in, and that would improve your imagination enough so that you could imagine universes where God was not important. I claim that it is not hard to invent universes, possible universes, hypothetical universes, not necessarily our own, but universes that are self-contained, consistent, coherent, and in which God plays no special role, no role at all. So here's a universe.
Okay, pause it.
Apologies for.
So before we get into that, so
Yeah.
so I feel like what he did is he's like implicitly throwing shade at like the modal, like the ontological argument people, right?
Yep.
But it's like the ontological argument is there are so many different ontological arguments, and there are so many different schools of thought about these ontological arguments. And I love that one book about ontological arguments. You know, I forget, it was like from Anselm to Nagasawa or something like that, where like there's been a lot of work done about ontological arguments, proving different things, or at least arriving at conclusions in many different ways. And so he's saying, notice that he says that he keeps using imagine, right? I can't imagine. He started off saying, I can't imagine.
So it's actually interesting because it's very similar to David Hume's own objection,
right,
which is like, okay, well, we can conceive of reality with nothing, right? But actually, when you really think about it, if we say that that conceivability entails, because again, what theism, in order for God to be metaphysically necessary, if you're going to say, you have to basically deny the possibility that God is metaphysically necessary if you want to avoid.
Well, if God isn't necessary, defined as metaphysically necessary being, then you have to deny the possibility of God as that's described exists just in general.
Right.
And so the thing I wanted to say here real quick is that right. What was the problem with Hume is that the field of modal logic had yet to be really developed as far as it is now. And I have a book of modal metaphysics on my shelf over there. I wish I could grab it, but it's a little ways away. But yeah, I mean, you have modal logic, you have modal metaphysics. We understand the logic of the possible and the necessary. We understand the logic of possibility, right? And so I think theists would agree, those who have worked very hard on ontological arguments would agree that we shouldn't just use imagination or conceivability as our guide to what is possible, right? And some people even think that our judgment about what is metaphysically possible, you know, we need hypotheses about those, right? And so there are really constrained ways and systems of thought that are informing how we're actually making these. Oh, where did the other
I'm
one?
trying to get to the. Hold on.
But let me take it seriously for just a little bit and sort of give you my feelings as a scientist about this. How would we refute?
Okay, there we go.
Yeah. And so he's basically going after the idea that you just you use your imagination, you use conceivability as a guide to possibility, and then you basically just bring God into the world as a logically necessary being. But like I said before, like most theists, at least in publication, don't entertain the idea that God is logically possible, necessary, but metaphysically necessary. So these ontological arguments that he might be going after, I don't think he's really going after what's really have his representation here. And so another thing is,
I have notes on this.
Okay, you do?
Yeah. So the problem with his argument is that conceivability does not always imply possibility. To be clear, we can distinguish between conceptual possibilities and ontological possibilities. Right. So Sean Carroll here is relying on conceptual possibilities, but conceptual possibilities have to do with what's possible for you to imagine.
Yes.
However, ontological possibilities are about the nature of the world.
Yes.
And so while you might be able to conceive of a world without anything, so conceive a world of, or any, like, let's say if I conceive a world of nothing, and then Sean Carroll conceives of a world without God, right? Just for the sake of argument, that doesn't tell us anything about whether the world could actually be nothing or whether the world could be this way, ontologically speaking, right? Another thing to consider is that if we're going to grant that conceivability is a guide to possibility. Then we can conceive that God does exist, and therefore God exists by like S5 modal logic,
Right.
right? So if we're going to use Sean Carroll's own assumptions, which basically come from David Hume, then that does imply that God exists.
Now, yeah, and he is a neo-Humean when it comes to a lot of his philosophy, so I'm not surprised about that. Now, what he says is we have to find a counterexample, and he uses the word where God doesn't play a role. And so what's really
Yeah.
interesting is he's shifting understandings, right? Because he shifts away from the a priori example where whatever shape the universe takes, if God is this like logically necessary being, then it really just doesn't matter what shape the universe takes. God will always play that role, right? He'll always play the role of existing in that universe. So he shifts away from it's just going to be logically true that God's going to exist in any way that the universe can exist, to, well, we should find universes where invoking God as an explanation doesn't really increase the probability of finding our observations. And to me, that's very different, because then you would have to shift away from this a priori logically true fact to this idea of having a criteria, an inductive criteria like Swinburne, and basically being able to look at evidence for and against God. So you have one area where you really can't have evidence for and against God because he just exists logically in a logically necessary way. And then he wants to go play a role, which is the explanatory way, over here where we can provide evidence against God, which would be in terms of rebutting defeaters. I think that to show that a logically necessary being doesn't exist, it would have to be in terms of undercutting defeaters, right? At least that's what it sounds like to me. You would have to show that there's an incoherence, right? You'd have to deny you'd have to show that it's not even possible for this being to exist, and then therefore all the logical possibility goes with it. And so it's like maybe we could take Carroll's term of like plays no role in a sense of saying, well, maybe there's something that we could find out about the model of the God that we're working with, and then show it to be incoherent and therefore show that it doesn't exist. But again, he's going to want to do that through some kind of empirical example in a universe. And so I think that's we have to distinguish what kinds of theisms we're critiquing. Because what he's doing right here, we need to find a universe where God doesn't play a role. Well, that would be like more of like a Swinburnian theism, versus this logically necessary idea, which would be like what we're talking about, which would be like the strongest form of an ontological argument. So you have the a priori, you have the a posteriori. We have to, I think, distinguish those. What do you think?
Yeah, another thing is he is critiquing specifically the idea that God is a necessary being. But even if we like, I feel like even if we're gonna limit the objections to that specific form of theism, his objection just to the ontological argument or even a modal argument is just not going to work, right? Because all the theist has to do is just deny that conceivability says anything about metaphysical possibility, right?
Right.
So yeah, I yeah, I feel like this is really at best an objection to like some logical argument. So like trying to show that God is logically necessary, but I don't. Yeah. Anyways, I'm gonna see how I'll just play it.
The claim that God is a necessary being, for example, and I should also admit that I'm happily conflating all sorts of ultimately different kinds of a priori metaphysical arguments: first cause, prime mover, necessary being. These are all subtly different in ways that I'm going to completely ignore. So sorry about that. They have a similar flavor, and I'm going to treat them similarly. So if you did believe that God was a necessary being, that you literally could not imagine a universe in which God did not play an important role, in order logically for me to refute that belief, all I need to do is to invent a universe in which God does not exist. If you say that all swans are white as a logical fact, all I need to do is show you one black swan to show that your logical argument can't be right. So all we need to do is invent a universe that God does not play a role in, and that would improve your imagination enough so that you could imagine universes where God was not important.
Positive.
I claim that it is not hard to invent.
Yeah.
So I just real quick on the all swans are white, and then find that, which is that, well, the idea there would be that would be an inductive one, right? So he would be right to say, okay, well, all I have to do is find one that breaks the pattern, because the whole idea of thinking that all swans are white would be because you are doing an inductive generalization. In this particular region of the world, I only observe white swans, and so I'm just going to extrapolate these properties and say that the entire set or domain swan is white. And it's not based off of a logical argument. Like I don't think anybody's going here and developing these deductive syllogisms, using S5 modal logic to show that all swans are white or something like that. I think that it's just that, like, that's an example of inductive generalization, extrapolating a property to similar properties about a particular domain. So I think he is absolutely consistent to say that, well, if I just find you a counterexample, I can show that your inductive generalization was wrong. It was fallacious. But that doesn't track with the idea of what he was critiquing about theism earlier, because if it's a priori true, then it doesn't matter
you
what
can't
empirical data you find.
Right. So it's maybe he's just using it as an example. Maybe he's just kind of saying that, like, okay, well, if we're going to argue that God is logically necessary, then all I have to do is just imagine a universe where God doesn't exist or something. Then
yeah, but what would that even mean? Because if God's logically necessary, then what would it mean? Then wouldn't that be an incoherent claim? Because the idea is that if
right, so it would depend on the argument. However, if he's going to say that, because inductive generalizations don't work when we're talking about deduction, right?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that if you're going to because the idea with God being logically necessary, not metaphysically necessary, is that if you deny God's existence, you are saying a contradiction, because it's logically true that God must exist. So to say that God doesn't exist would imply a contradiction. So for Sean Carroll to say, well, I have to show you a universe where God doesn't exist, well, the whole idea is that God logically, like in the strongest form, must exist. So what you're trying to show me is a contradictory universe, which just is an impossible state of affairs. That's what I'm saying. Like that just seems incoherent to say if he's using that term. But if it's metaphysical necessity, that's completely different.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't really have much else to say, but it seems to me like he's conflating those kind of terms. Yeah. And I feel like no matter how you interpret him, it's not gonna work. So
okay, yeah, we can go ahead.
Universes, possible universes, hypothetical universes, not necessarily our own, but universes that are self-contained, consistent, coherent, and in which God plays no special role, no role at all. So here's a universe. Apologies for the math. This universe is three-dimensional space, evolving in time, and in that space there is one particle. That is the whole universe. This particle moves according to Newton's laws of motion under the influence of some potential energy. So here's space, there's time, there's our particle moving. It has an equation of motion. And this goes on forever into the infinite far past or the infinite far future. I claim this is a logically conceivable universe, that you can't stop me from imagining that this is the universe. It's clearly not our universe. I'm not trying to claim that there is some complicated transformation that makes our real world look like this. But this could be a universe, and there's no God in this universe. There's just a particle moving. If you want a slightly more realistic example, here's a universe that I think might actually be right. I replace, instead of three-dimensional space, I have a space of states, which is some Hilbert space. That is to say, some quantum mechanics.
Okay, so I didn't catch this when I first watched the video, but he's really running really far with this whole conceivability equals like possibility idea.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of at a hard place right now, because we just outright reject that. So everything he's doing in this presentation right now really just doesn't matter, because he's saying I can conceive of God not existing.
Yeah,
that's all he's doing. It's just a complex way of conceiving of God not existing.
Right. And so if we're gonna take what the timestamp says, which is how to refute God as a necessary being, if we reject that conceivability entails metaphysical possibility, his argument doesn't work. If we grant him that conceivability does entail metaphysical possibility, he's contradicting himself, because if I can conceive, if I'm granting him that I can just conceive a universe where God exists, right? Because I can also do that. You can't stop me from conceiving that. And if conceivability is a guide to metaphysical possibility, then it's metaphysically possible that God exists. And if God is necessary, then S5 modal logic, God exists. So no matter which way you go, his argument doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't matter how you interpret him in this, you can interpret one way or the other. Either way, no matter how you interpret what he's saying, his argument here is not going to work. At least when it comes to his argument that we can refute God as necessary being.
It's so strange because it's like, if we can conceive of God, like just going with this example, like if God is supposed to be a logically necessary being using his language, because we want to go with metaphysical possibility, but with that metaphysical necessity, but if you go with the fact that God as defined as a logically necessary being, then like if conceivability is the way in which I access the truth of that proposition, then again, it's just a weird exercise in trying to show us different ways a universe could be. To show the logical impossibility, because it's either logically possible or it's logically impossible. If it's logically possible, then it's logically necessary. So he has to show that this whole idea is logically impossible. But this is a weird way to show that it's logically impossible. He would have to show it's logically impossible by looking at the nature of the being in question here. Right. So, like you're saying, yeah, whatever way we go, this is a very interesting set of circumstances. And maybe we just have to get through these clips. I don't know.
Yeah.
Space of possible states, the space of wave functions, if you like. There's also time evolution. So the state is an element of that Hilbert space, and it evolves with time. If you want to know how it evolves, well, it solves this equation, Schrodinger's equation, where this capital H is an operator called the Hamiltonian, which basically tells you how the state evolves with time. So this universe is one that is mathematically isomorphic to a trajectory in a Hilbert space according to this Schrodinger's equation. It goes forever, from the infinite far past to the infinite far future. It is self-contained. There's no something outside this universe that is holding it up, sustaining it, keeping it going, causing it to exist, or allowing it to persist. It is simply that mathematical structure, full stop. I actually, like I said, think that this is a plausible mathematical structure for the real world in which we live. Clearly, there are some details to be filled in. I need to know what the actual Hamiltonian of the world is, which I don't claim to know. But this is a plausible framework for reality. And just to give you a final idea of what kinds of universes I'm thinking about, here is a world, a universe. It's one point. This is actually bigger than a point because it's hard to show you a point. So this is a circle. But imagine a mathematical structure that is isomorphic to a single point. I claim that is a possible universe. Once again, it is not our universe in any interesting way, but it is a conceivable universe. And once again, God plays no role. So what am I trying to...
It's also conceivable that God exists.
Right. So then,
and if conceivability is a guide to possibility, then I could show by my conceivability that it's possible that God exists. Therefore, by S5 modal logic, God exists. Like,
so. Yeah. This is very strange because he keeps using the word "play a role," and so he keeps switching back and forth. It's like, okay, it plays no explanatory role or plays no logically necessary role, because using the language he's using, well, obviously it is playing a logically necessary role. That's going to persist independently of any type of universe you conceive of. But if it's an explanatory role, well then that's the way that you and I want to argue, Kyle. We want to do the Swinburnian project here.
I'm not really a fan of ontological arguments, but I mean, I still am kind of a fan of like certain, like I know Rasmussen has his arguments, his contingency arguments. So there are certain contingency arguments that I still find to be plausible and you can defend them. But if we're going to use these objections, Sean Carroll's objections to those arguments, I don't think they work at all, for the reasons I've already mentioned. Because either we deny that conceivability entails metaphysical possibility, or we grant that it does. And if we grant that it does, I can just conceive that God does exist, and you can just use the same argument. Basically, you can use some kind of modal ontological argument. So yeah.
Yeah, this is interesting. I just never caught it like this before, him putting it like this. But yeah, I guess if we're going to be as charitable and good faith to Sean as possible, let's just scratch that he's responding to these ontological argument ideas of God, and let's just say that we're both kind of testing theories right now.
Yep.
In the a posteriori sense. Then okay, then what can we do? Okay, well then, yeah, a universe with a single point, right? Well, is that more likely on theism than its negation? I would say that might be inscrutable. It might be, because I don't because if we look at the negation, let's say it's naturalism. Well, naturalism makes absolutely no prediction about that whatsoever. Does theism make a prediction about a point? Well, maybe even theism might do better, because at least theism would say that something would exist, understanding the nature of God that we're positing, right? So a point might not be the exact thing, in a mathematical probability that we can just a priori come up with, but epistemically, I would say that a point is epistemically friendlier to theism than naturalism, just in the sense that, well, something will exist on theism. And a point isn't a negative state of affairs, so it's not an evil. So,
well, I'm wondering if it would contradict, though, the plenitude principle. I think it would.
So then if that's something, then that would be a kind of species that we can just shave off.
Right.
So, but yeah.
Yeah, I know you have. If you want to mention your own argument, I know you you argue that
right. So
particulars are
right. So if this is a concrete particular, then it's intrinsically valuable. So that if it's intrinsically valuable, then theism predicts it, right? Now, obviously, I don't think that this is the kind of universe that theism predicts.
Yeah,
like the kind of theism that I hold to, or we hold to. But I would say that, just given this toy example, if we're just talking about like which is more epistemically friendly to what, I mean, if it's a concrete particular, and concrete particulars are intrinsically valuable, then theism predicts it, because there's this relation axiological relevance that obtains between them. So I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so I don't know if it would work on our type of theism, but there might be some other species of theism that it could fit better with. So anyways.
Yeah.
To get at here, what I'm trying to get at is that if you sat down again a priori and tried to think about all the possible ways that existence could manifest itself, we know that to at least some extent there are mathematical ways of talking about existence, talking about the real world. I can easily imagine self-contained and consistent mathematical structures in which the notion of God or necessary beings or first causes play no role whatsoever. Now, this is not some brilliant new insight. The people who do believe in necessary beings and so forth have a response to this. They will say, sure, you can imagine that, but they're not really legitimate possibilities for what the world can be like. And that's because there's no explanation. Fundamentally, there's no reason why the world is like that. That the role of God is to ground why this world rather than some other, or indeed why this world at all, why a world at all. So the response to my examples would be, sure, you can mathematically write those down, but you haven't explained why that would be the universe. And my response to those arguments is, so what? Who is to say that I'm supposed to explain why there is a universe? You might prefer that there be an explanation as to why this universe rather than that universe, but you can't prove logically that there must be some explanation. The universe could just be.
Pause it. Okay, so he keeps using this idea of logical,
mm-hmm.
like there might be no logical explanation. Well, again, this discussion is taking place within the realm of what's metaphysically possible, what's metaphysically necessary, right? So we don't have to say that there's some logically necessary reason why the universe, why something exists rather than nothing, right? So he's kind of hinting onto these contingency argument type lines of thinking, right? But theists aren't really arguing. Rasmussen isn't arguing this. Kuhns isn't arguing this. Leftow, O'Connor, they aren't arguing on the basis of a logical necessity that we need that these things have an explanation. Rather, we're taking metaphysical data, right? And what's the metaphysical data here? Well, the metaphysical data here is contingency, that the states of affairs that we observe could have failed to exist. And
maybe one candidate would be like Sijuwadi's argument from grounding. So if we imagine
grounding is another example of a metaphysical datum, exactly,
right,
that we
so
observe grounding layers.
Now, what Sean wants to say, if I'm going to be charitable, is that I don't need to explain why there's grounding or why things exist, right? There's no explanation. My response to that would basically be that that explanation is a guide to confirmation.
Right.
Right. So actually, the hypothesis that explains the data is more probable than the one that doesn't. So if you have a theory that doesn't explain the data, your theory is going to be less plausible than the one that does explain the data, right? That given observation, so if we say the observation in this case is contingency, and if theism explains that, then that's going to confirm theism against the negation, right? Assuming that there is no, assuming that the arrival theory doesn't have some kind of explanation. And now I am aware that there are some naturalistic theories that might be able to explain this, like, Graham Oppy's view might be able to, would be able to explain it. However, if Sean Carroll is going to go the route of, well, I don't need explanation at all, well, then Sean Carroll's view is not going to,
Kyle,
it's not going to work.
I think that you are actually thinking of this at a higher level than he's thinking. I literally think that he's just stopping at logical necessity. I think he's saying that it's not logically necessary that there is an explanation, and that's it. I don't even think he's even talking about what you're talking about. I think that he's actually saying that, well, it's not logically necessary that there needs to be an explanation of these concrete facts. And in that sense, then I could grant, that's not a hill I'm going to die on. I could totally grant that and have my theistic arguments go through. Cool. Let's step away from logical necessity then. Let's just focus on the metaphysical data on the table, and let's just talk about it in terms of epistemic probability. What is more epistemically probable? That you find this data on theism or you find this data on its negation. But I don't think he's even doing that right here. I think he's just wanting to say, well, it's not logically necessary that we need to find an explanation. So then I don't need to be so worried about it because of issues about logical necessity. But it's like, Carroll, that's not what theistic arguments are even trying to do. That's not what Swinburne's trying to do. That's not what Craig is trying to do. So I think that, honestly, I think that that's what he's trying to say here, because he keeps bringing this idea of logical necessity.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if he even is he attacking do you feel like he's attacking a straw man? I feel like he.
I think he might, and I hate to call out people for attacking straw men, because it just seems to me to be low-hanging fruit. But this honestly might just be a typical straw man fallacy, that that the theisms defended by the world-class theists of today, Rasmussen, Kuhns, Proust, O'Connor, Leftow, Sijuwadi, etc., they don't. This is not the ideas they're concerning themselves with. This is not how they argue for their theism. Craig, throw Craig on the table, right? Craig has never argued like this.
Right. So, anyways, we'll see if he's actually strawmanning or not.
Right. Yeah. Let's keep going.
That is the fundamental disagreement between people who believe in a metaphysical notion of God and the more empirically minded scientists. So let me flesh that out just a little bit. Just because we have a universe isn't necessarily true that there is some explanation or reason or cause. I think that the reason why you'd be tempted to think that is because in our actual universe, you associate causes with events. Things happen, you go, I can explain to you why that happened. Here is the reason why. Now, there's two things to notice about that. One is that there are very often multiple different sounding reasons that you could give for a single event. Why did this football team lose their match? Well, because the goalie let in that goal, or well, because they were ill prepared, or well, because space-time is four-dimensional. There's many possible reasons you could give. What counts as a reason depends on the framework in which you are speaking. Reasons are not existing once and for all uniquely all by themselves. They appear within contexts. And the context in which the whole universe appears is different, whatever it might be, than all of the contexts in which things inside the universe appear. Even if it were true, and I don't think that it is true, but even if it were true that everything inside the universe can be associated with a reason or a cause, that doesn't mean that the same thing applies to the universe itself. It may or may not. And so the second point is that you might want to eventually.
It's interesting that he leaves that part open-ended. All the contents we observe about the universe have an explanation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the universe in totality, in toto, has an explanation. It could or could not. So he leaves that up to.
I actually agree with him on this point if he means universe as in total reality. And this is actually one of Rasmussen's first arguments.
Right. I know exactly what you mean, Dennis. Yeah.
Let me see if I can find where Rasmussen was talking about this. Hold on, let me.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean by this point, and it's a good point to bring up.
Intro. Okay. I have to go back to like my old scripts.
Except John Smith's series.
So let's take this argument. Premise 1. The blob of everything includes all that exists. Premise 2. Therefore, no existing thing is outside the blob of everything. Premise 3. Therefore, no existing thing is outside. Therefore, no existing cause is outside the blob of everything. Therefore, no existing thing outside the blob of everything caused the blob of everything to exist. Now, I think that is a sound argument.
Yeah.
So if Sean Carroll means if he means the universe as in all that exists, then I agree with him. Like logically, you can't have something outside
of all that exists. Yeah,
right.
That's just contradiction, right? So the totality of reality cannot have an explanation because that explanation would be a part of the totality of reality. So the totality of reality just cannot have an explanation. Exactly. And that's what he means. And if we're going to be charitable to him, that's what he means, then right. We can totally agree with that. Counterpoint. We can leave that aside. We can say, yes, but the particular datum that we are focusing on, does that have an explanation, right? And so if we're talking about is the nature of either the field state or whatever the bedrock to physical reality or space-time is that entity, is that the nature of that entity is it a contingent entity? Is it a metaphysically necessary entity? Right? Is it how, are there any inexplicable features, right? Like that's what we're trying to focus on. So we could grant that part. I like that you did that. We're still keeping Sean on the bridge of reason with us. But on that part, we're shining our light on something really interesting. And we're saying, yes, but we want to focus on these metaphysical features of the contents in our universe that prompt many people to invoke a theistic explanation.
Right. And not only that, but if the theist can show that theism makes that like things existing, like let's take some contingency argument as an example. That contingency is that theism can explain that, and we don't have to posit these brute facts or anything like that. Because when you start positing brute facts, that's just admitting that you don't have an explanation, right? And so what you want to do what Brian Liftow has argued before, which is you want to minimize bruteness. You want to make sure that your theory doesn't have a lot, like whatever theory. I mean, of course, I think every theory is going to have brute facts, but the question is not whether it has brute facts. The question is which theory has the least amount of brute facts, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so if the theist can show that theism has less brute facts than naturalism, that's going to favor theism against the negation, right?
Yeah.
So if Sean Carroll is going to say, well, the universe is just a brute fact, well, so if we're going to say it's a brute fact, what is it? Like, what is it about the universe? And maybe he has some answer to that question.
Right.
Like maybe he thinks it's some quantum field or whatever, right? But if you're going to go down that route, then you would have to have a further discussion about, if is positing a quantum field, like if we're going to say let's just say it's a brute fact that the quantum field exists and then this quantum field kind of evolved through Hilbert space to produce our universe. if we're gonna say that, well, number one, are we going to, do we have a theory that's actually more simple? So do we have a theory that isn't as complex, right? And I would say that, our kind of theism, like a trope theoretic theism, is going to have an advantage there because God is just one entity with zero properties, zero kinds, whereas a wave function is going to have multiple properties and multiple kinds, right? So so basically what the theist can do is show like, hey, my hypothesis is simpler in that sort of respect. And then also, you can also invoke your own principle, which is the axiological relevance thesis, right? And show how contingency itself is something that's axiologically relevant. That's going to favor theism against its negation, right? So epistemically, if we put that in there, then it's going to favor theism. Now, of course, what Sean's might want to do is maybe he rejects some line of reasoning that I just went through, but yeah.
I think that I don't even think Sean's even at epistemic probability yet. I think that Sean I think what I can see here is that there might be a little bit of paralysis on his part about being thrown, this idea that Rasmussen talks about like using arguments as weapons, that I feel like Sean has been hit many times with these very strong deductive arguments.
Yep.
For why there needs to be an explanation, that he's still thinking in terms of logical necessity. Because in a deductive argument, the conclusion follows inescapably from the premises. It's impossible for the conclusion to be false. It's logically necessarily follows in that the strongest sense. So I think for Sean, he's not even talking about a inductive criteria for explanation. I think that he's still focused on that. So we're not even at epistemic probability yet.
Yeah. So if he's talking about deduction, then I would agree with that, because all he really has to do is then parrot the theistic, depending on which argument you use, parrot the theistic arguments and show how like one of the premises can be rationally rejected, right?
Mm-hmm. Or you can modify one of the premises to where it fits very well in a non-theistic paradigm that move as well. Here's the thing I wanted to say, which is that, because we always like to say the universe, and then we know in philosophy and metaphysics or ontology, right? You have different views. Like you have priority monism, for example, right? Which is a prior posterior relation, right? That the general relativistic space-time manifold exists ontologically prior to the contents or the regions of space-time contained within that manifold. And so the properties of the manifold are those regions of space-time. And so the universe actually pins down these posterior relations of space-time down. That's one view. And then there's like priority pluralism, which is like the universe is a merely logical sum of simples. There's different ways that we could talk about the universe. So it's like, if we're going to say like, what's our explanatory target, then we could say, okay, is our explanatory target the simples? If it's the simple, then we only need one, right? Because if everything is grounded or metaphysically reduces to a simple, it's going to be this invariable simple, right? Given this physicalist paradigm that everything's just uniform matter. Then we only need to explain that, and then everything else goes. Principle of irrelevant differences and slight differences would get us that. And then if it's priority monism, right, then we're simply explaining the I guess how could you say it? Well, in Sijawadi's argument, right, he's explaining why.
I don't think we have to get into that.
No, we don't. But the idea, I'm just going through what like the different explanatory targets here. The explanatory target isn't, because I want to get away from explaining things in terms of wholes, right?
Yeah.
And the idea there with this general relativistic space-time manifold pinning down the region of space-time as its posterior relations is we're trying to explain the phenomenon of pinning down all these relations, right? That's like what we're trying to explain. So, but again, like I said, I don't think we're even there with this part of the present, like with this presentation as of yet. So let's keep going. Let's see where he goes.
I was gonna say one question. We're only 1/4 of the way done, and we're already at an hour.
I know, it's crazy. Yeah, maybe I don't know. Let's just keep going. Let's just see what happens.
Yeah.
And a principle. You might want to invent a way of thinking, the principle of sufficient reason or something like that, that simply demands that things have explanations, that nothing that occurs does so without a reason why. But my response to that would be, why? Why is it necessary that everything have a reason why? And you could give an argument. You say, well, when I look at the universe, everything that happens has a reason why. But the point is that you're now taking your metaphysical argument and turning it into an empirical one. Why is it necessary for things to have reasons or explanations? Well, I see that things have reasons or explanations, but that doesn't mean that you can simply draw the conclusion that everything that happens must happen for a reason. The example that I like to use is conservation of energy, because conservation of energy is something, well, you look around, you see a lot of different things happening, a lot of different processes, dynamical happenings in the world. And you go, look, every single time I can associate a number, the energy, which is constant over time. It doesn't change in the process of this dynamical event. So I invent a law of nature, conservation of energy. But the point is, the logic is not, I see that energy is conserved, therefore energy is conserved. The logic is, I see that energy is conserved, therefore I make a hypothesis. I imagine that energy is actually conserved, and then I go out and test that hypothesis.
Okay, so pause.
It's an empirical.
Yes.
So, but I think that's what we're doing with the whole principle of explanation, right? I think that what people have done, I think what theists have done, I think it's uncharitable to say that theists came up with this a priori principle of explanation and went out and just subjected it all to the world. I think what has happened is people went, well, usually what we like to do in rational inquiry, either it comes to science or philosophy, is we try to explain things as far as we can, the principle of explaining things as far as we can. And we go, oh, okay. Well, then we go, well, then what are the features? Like why can we explain things as far as we can? And that's what we're talking about. We come up with these hypotheses. Well, our hypothesis could be this principle of explaining things as far as we can. But then we could go, but wait a minute. Why are certain objects, like why are these things able to be explained? And then we do this, and then we find out that there's these metaphysical features of objects where, oh, we can call these things contingent. These are the kinds of things that are able to be explained. I think that's exactly what the theist has done. We've gone, there's a striking feature of the world. Things are explained. Well, then if that's the case, then we can start to think about ultimate explainers, or whether or not if there's no stop to explanation. I mean, this is what opens up the conversation. So I think that Sean is being a little bit uncharitable to how the theists have thought about these things. I don't think theists just sat around one day on a Tuesday or something and went, I'm going to come up with this random principle explanation and see if it works. Like, I think that we just have, like, this is our experience. And then we come up with hypotheses, like he's talking about, to make sense of this experience.
And not only that, but there's also different versions of the PSR. And Rasmussen and Proust have different versions that they use in their book.
Necessary Existence completely is like the go-to book.
Yeah, and so some of those principles are, some of the different versions of the PSR are kind of interesting because, for example, you could actually use the PSR, let's say a materialistic version of the PSR, and say, well, all we observe are material phenomena. But because God is an immaterial being, then we can't infer, that if we could just infer, all that we observe is material phenomena, God's a material being, therefore God. So I feel
there's
like
no material causes.
But notice how it's a priori argument, but it's also a posteriori argument because you're inferring that there's material causes, right? That's the whole materialist. I think it's what's it called? The
principle of material causation.
Yeah, so it's that principle, and it's not like only theists are doing this. You also have atheists that do the same thing, but just in reverse, right? So yeah, it's not like only theists are the ones that are
right.
Using
and again, this helps Carroll because this is not some tribalistic thing. This goes for all sides. We all come up with different principles of explanation. I think we're all following the same line of reasoning. So Carroll this doesn't need to be something that he needs to reject.
Right. So,
all right, let's keep going.
When I look for a logical foundation in the basis of some wider theory, and I actually do tests. There are experimental tests of energy conservation. It might be wrong. Likewise, if you see that everything in the universe happens for a reason, which I don't think is actually true, but even if you saw that, you would at best be able to say, therefore, I hypothesize that perhaps everything happens for a reason. Perhaps, therefore, the universe has a cause or a reason. But that's not simply a metaphysical demand. That is an idea that you should go out and test.
So
I would agree.
yeah.
But look, we can test it via argument. We can test it via by metaphysics. There's many ways we can test this.
Right.
So it goes back to being an empirical claim and should be evaluated accordingly. As just one more example, there's something called the Kalam cosmological argument that begins by saying that everything that has a beginning has a cause. And therefore, it says the universe has a beginning. And it then says the universe has a beginning, therefore the universe must be caused. But the response to this is maybe not. I mean,
that's not really a refutation.
Wait. Hold on. The response to that is maybe not. Wow, I feel really bad for all the philosophers in all of the journals that have spent years. I feel bad that Graham Oppie and Locke had a 160 email exchange on this argument.
Yeah.
If the response is maybe not. Okay, now that's the worst interpretation of what Sean's saying. The good interpretation of Sean's saying is, well, if we can find that everything that begins to exist either doesn't have a cause, we can find that, or we can say that we can refute the premise 2 that says that the universe began to exist. So we could show that, then the Kalam failed. I agree. We can bring into question the truth of the premises. Yes.
Yeah, I'm not gonna try to defend the Kalam here, but yeah.
Yeah, let's keep going.
You need to say, no, it's not true that everything that has a beginning has a cause. All I need to be able to say is maybe there are things that happen without causes. It then becomes an empirical claim that I need to go out and judge, just like I judge every other scientific theory, just like conservation of energy. So the conclusion of this kind of reasoning is that...
Well, see, but that's a metaphysical notion. I don't know how you can empirically test something coming to existence without a cause. Because... I just wonder how you would even test that empirically. Like
you can't. Yeah. Even if we say, for the sake of argument, like, oh, here's a bicycle that just literally came from nowhere. Well,
I could be skeptical. I can be like,
yeah,
but I have this alternative theory. I could say that there are happenings in physics we don't understand that led particles up to this moment of being conglomerated in such a way where a bike manifests itself or displaced the space around it, right? We could say that there's a source for it still. I could still say that I could come up with some theory about there being a source.
Yeah. So
I think that it's false to say that this would be an empirical matter.
Now, what's interesting is he says God should be judged as an empirical hypothesis. And I just want to mention that when we're talking about hypotheses, and I'm going to reference argument and inference, and then a introduction to inductive logic, they actually define theory in a very particular way, which actually matches very well with Swinburne's own work. So this is, give you a quote. As stated in chapter 1, the induction by confirmation is used when trying to understand something that cannot be inspected directly. A hypothesis is a proposed description or explanation of the phenomena that cannot be inspected. In other words, you start off with you look out into the world, you say, I need to explain this data, this empirical data. So I'm going to posit this unobservable entity that explains this observable entity. Well, that's how all science works. We explain the observable from the unobservable, right? Yeah. So if we're talking about empirical hypothesis as how it's used in scientific terms, then yeah, you propose something that you look out into the world, you have some datum, you want to explain it. I have to propose something that I can't directly observe to explain it. That's how theism works. Yeah. We propose God, something we don't directly observe, to explain the world, to explain, well, it depends on, what you're trying to explain. But yeah, to explain why the world is the way it is.
Yeah.
So right. I'm kind of wondering if what he's talking about empirical hypothesis is that you have to empirically show that God exists. And I think that's just wrong, because if you're gonna say that, well, then all of science would just collapse, basically.
Well, right. It's also a matter of metaphysics, right? I mean, I love how Sijawadi responded to Aaron Ra in their actual live debate, where he said, "Demonstrate this," and he says, "Sure." He's like, "You can demonstrate God." I said, "Sure, we can." He said, "How?" And he said, "With metaphysics." It's like that simple. We can we can investigate this with metaphysics, because it's of the domain of metaphysics.
Right. So, but yeah, I mean, other than that, I would agree with Carroll's, I guess, very brief idea of like what the best explanation is. So, a good explanation is one where you have the simplest hypothesis that explains the largest amount of data. So you want to start off with, something. You start off with very small content, and then you try to explain. Right. So in that sense, I agree with Sean Carroll here. But yeah, if you want to continue.
Yeah.
Okay.
We should think about God as an empirically testable hypothesis, not as something that is completely a priori. Even the purported metaphysical arguments that God is necessary ultimately come down to contingent empirical claims. So what we should actually be asking is, does including God in our ontology, does having God play a role in our conception of how the world works, give us the best possible theory on conventional scientific grounds? Now, admittedly, we don't understand what those conventional scientific grounds are with perfect clarity. The idea of what is the best possible explanation for something, even within science, is a bone of contention. But I'm not going to get into that in any detail. I think we all sort of know it when we see it, when it comes to what makes a good scientific theory. We're looking for something that is a simple, coherent theory that explains the largest amount of data. And when it comes to that, it's not hard to imagine aspects of the observed world that you might say the best possible explanation for this observed phenomenon is the existence of God. Historically, that has certainly been true. So motion is one of them. Remember, one of Aristotle's conceptions of God is an unmoved mover. And this is the one, when I was an undergraduate at my Catholic university taking all those religion courses, made the least sense to me. And it took me years later until I finally figured out why it made no sense to me, why you needed to have an explanation for why things are moving. And the answer was that in an Aristotelian metaphysics, you're basing what happens on Aristotelian physics, in which motion is something that needs to be explained, right? In Aristotelian physics, in order to get something moving, you have to push on it and keep pushing on it. And we see things moving all over the place, so there must be something doing some ultimate pushing in some sense. But then along comes what we now know as conservation of momentum. Avicenna and Newton and Galileo point out that left to their own devices, things do not need to be pushed constantly to keep moving. Things will just keep moving. So the idea that things are moving is not something that needs to be explained. It is just something that is a law of physics. It is an aspect of the world. I think that the shift in theological thinking that sort of implicitly followed the invention of Newtonian mechanics is an interesting and underdeveloped thing to think about. There is, of course, life. And I think that for many people now and in...
So yeah, so the thing about Joe's kind of defense of existential inertia, that once in existence, always in existence, right? Unless taken out of existence, right? And that idea, and I think that there is something there on the side of not needing God. As we don't need to include God in our ontology to explain that. But the idea here is that conservation of momentum is, like you said, as part of the laws of physics. And the idea here is that, well, God is to explain laws of physics. So I think when it comes to this whole unmoved mover, right? I think we would all agree that theistic arguments we don't say that anymore. Like we don't say, oh yeah, I have an argument for an unmoved mover, right? Like that was like theistic arguments have progressed very much in how we argue for God and what data we use to argue from God. But I think that Aristotle had the right idea given the particular time frame and what he was ignorant of at the time, which was that I don't think that a conservation of energy law gets rid of completely this need for God, but rather it pushes it back a step. It goes, okay, well, we understand that there are these laws about why entities persist, right? And
but
it's
then
like, okay,
then push it back to the some kind of nomenological.
And then you have
argument.
nomenological arguments. We have arguments about laws of nature, arguing that laws of nature are to be more expected on theism than its negation. So I think that aside from other higher like metaphysical notions of persistence and sustaining and things, we have existential inertia versus God and things of that sort. Other proposed theories like atemporal wave function monism or whatnot. I think that this idea, when it just comes to the nomology or the gnomic regularity, I think that that's more so what the theist is trying to use as their data. But let's look at all of these
Yeah.
real quick, because we would say that everything listed here is evidence for theism, right? The left
Yeah.
side is obviously evidence for theism, but the right side, because honestly, this is almost like Draper's fallacy of understated evidence, or his kind of specific facts argument, right? Specific fact, motion. Oh, sorry, general fact, motion. But specific fact, we have, oh yeah, but it's conservation of momentum. It's just a law of nature. And so it's just a natural phenomenon. So theism doesn't really explain it all that well. So it actually can't be evidence for theism, or yeah, if you have chemistry, right? And things of that sort. Now, I would say that life and design are in terms of fine tuning, right? And to get chemistry, you need fine tuning, right? So that's evidence for theism. Consciousness, neuroscience question mark. That was a shot in the dark. And then origins, cosmology, again, nomological arguments. All of these things are still evidence for theism. And theism isn't isn't an alternative theory to science.
Right.
Theism is a metaphysical explanation of facts that we gain knowledge about through science.
I mean, even the existential inertia thesis is a metaphysical thesis.
Exactly.
So, anyways, well, I'll continue and see. I want to start to speed it up a little bit.
Cool. Let's go on.
Antiquity, the reason why we are tempted by supernatural explanations is because living beings look very different than non-living beings. Living beings are alive and conscious, and they respond in interesting ways. It seems like the simplest explanation that, when something dies, when it goes from being a living object, a living organism, to being a corpse, it seems like something changed. Something left it. Something is now absent that was there, some sort of spiritual energy, some life force. And that, I think, is one very obvious motivation in a primitive society for thinking that there's something beyond the merely physical. But nowadays...
All right, so do you want to respond to the physical stuff?
This doesn't really matter,
Okay.
honestly. I don't
No
think,
problem.
yeah.
We think that there's nothing about life or death that cannot be, in principle, explained just by chemistry and just by biology. There is, of course, design, not just the existence of living creatures, but the wonderful diversity of all the different species we have of creatures here on Earth. There was a British person called Charles Darwin who explained that in terms of natural selection. And nowadays, we're still left with some unanswered questions. There's the question of consciousness. What makes a person have a feeling of what it is to be themselves, to reflect, to think about things? I am hopeful that neuroscience is addressing and will continue to get better at understanding what consciousness really is. I'm not a professional neuroscientist. I'm not going to talk about that. But given the empirical success of science and giving naturalistic explanations for features of the universe, I see no obstacle to that happening in the case of consciousness.
I just want to say one thing. Right. Features of the universe. Science doesn't all address the intrinsic nature of anything.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
All right. Dope.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I just don't really see. I mean, at best, you could try to translate this into an argument from interstate evidence, as you mentioned earlier, right? But I think there are good responses to that. If you guys are, for the audience sake, if you guys are interested in our response to the understated evidence objection, you can listen to our presentation that we did on Capturing Christianity, and I also went over it on my channel as well as Suan Sona's channel. So, anyways, let's continue.
There's also, finally, the origin of the universe itself, and here I actually do have some expertise. What does naturalistic scientific modes of explanation have?
Okay, so notice what he just said. Naturalistic, I think it was, hold on. Was it modes of explanation? But he's equating that to the actual scientific cosmological theories within cosmology.
Right. He's going from a methodological claim to an ontological claim, where he's saying, how can we explain this within the ontological kind natural? By going from, well, we have in the physical sciences, in physics, we have these explanations, and that's natural, but that's also kind natural. But you and I can say, well, why can't my view just be natural?
Yeah. Especially with our view of God as a trope. Yeah.
Why? How is that no longer natural? Unless you really define it in a very strict way.
Right. So there's nothing that requires me as a theist to believe that God is supernatural in the way that Sean Carroll is talking about supernatural. Right.
Right.
And there's also, even if we're gonna be like idealists and say, oh well, God is some immaterial mind or whatever, like, okay, well, even that requires some kind of like a view of Aristotelian substances that trope theory doesn't operate on, right? Because on trope theory, everything is made of tropes, right? Of bundles of tropes, I should say.
Or I would say more accurately, trope theory makes its claims independent of anything doing with substance ontology.
Right.
It's compatible with either.
Right.
One
Right,
second.
so if
Let
we're
me
gonna,
go. Keep going. I'm just gonna turn off my heater. It's getting hot.
yeah. So I guess one thing I want to mention is that if we're going to say that we must limit ourselves to, let's say, physical substance, well, trope theory can account for that, because on trope theory, all that substances are basically bundles of tropes, right? So if if physical substances are bundles of tropes, then you could be a physicalist, right? As a trope, you can be a trope theorist and a physicalist, or you can be a trope theorist and an idealist, or you can be a trope theorist and a substitutalist. It doesn't matter if you're talking about physical, non-physical, mental, non-mental, supernatural, like all those terms don't matter when it comes to trope theory. So you can easily be consistent and say, yeah, all that exists is physical reality, and God is physical. He's just a trope. Right? God is just one trope that's physical, right? And that's it. So I don't know, Tim, did you want to add anything more to that? Good. So yeah, that's all I have to say on that. But yeah,
have to say about the origin of the universe. It is a traditional role for God to play. If you pick up the Bible, it's right there in the beginning. God is creating the whole universe.
Let's pause it real quick.
So here's what we know.
Start looking through these different time descriptions, because
he's gonna. I think. Hold on. Is it gonna?
Click the down arrow.
Wait, what do you mean?
Like that, like the down arrow on the thing right there, where it says the Big Bang.
Oh yeah. Like what about it?
No. Click. Actually, click the text. Click that. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
To the side there. So let's see what else he has, because some of these might be unnecessary for us to respond to. Like just scroll through them, like just to see what they say.
Physical parameters.
Physical constant.
We just got lucky.
Let's try that out.
I don't think that. You think this is necessary to? I don't think this is necessary to respond to. No.
Yeah, let's just go with this one.
Okay.
We just got lucky. It is not ever completely clear to me that asking this question is a sensible thing to do. Aren't we fortunate that the laws of nature allow us to be here, asking how fortunate we are? I'm not sure that that's a sensible question to ask, because if the laws of nature didn't allow us to be here, we would not be asking the question. Everyone who
So these are old replies to the fine-tuning argument.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to respond, or?
I mean the observer selection effect doesn't explain anything, because we're comparing, because it's not in our background knowledge, right? What's in our background knowledge is that we exist, sure, and we're conscious, we're aware that we exist. But what's the data in question is the fact that the laws of nature are stringent and not lax when it comes to our existence. So that's the fact that needs to be explained, not the fact that we observe that we exist.
Right. Selection effect. Yeah, so we just got lucky. So yeah, these are traditional responses. So we just got lucky. Life is a lot more generic than we think. Okay, so this is actually interesting. So selection effects, okay, that's just the self-selection effect objection. And in design, these are the possible explanations for fine-tuning.
Yeah, he's trying to give like the entire logical space of explanation.
Yeah. The best one is probably going to be this one for the non-theist.
Mm-hmm.
but that doesn't epistemically explain like why we would be in one universe rather than some other, right? Especially if you use the axiological relevance thesis. I don't know if did you want to say anything else about that particular?
Let's just see what he says about design.
Okay.
When it comes to explaining the existence of life, maybe for very different values of the parameters, there will be other kinds of life. It is extremely presumptuous, I think, to think that we understand perfectly when life could exist. Maybe life is quite generic. And then the last two more substantive possibilities are maybe what we're seeing is a selection effect. Maybe the parameters of nature are very different from place to place. Maybe most places they are utterly inhospitable to the existence of life. But of course, there's an environmental selection. We are only going to find ourselves in those regions of the universe that are hospitable to us existing. Therefore, we observe these finely tuned parameters. Or someone made it that way. God intervened, made the parameters because God wanted to make a universe where we could exist. What would be the point of a universe without us, after all? So let me just give a little bit of lip service to this second possibility, the idea that life is a lot more generic than we think it is, that the parameters don't need to be that finely tuned in order to get something like life. If we were really serious about making the claim that the parameters of the universe are clearly finely tuned in such a way as to allow for the existence of life, this is the kind of argument we would have to make. We would have to say, consider all possible physical theories, consider all possible cosmological manifestations of those laws of physics, consider all possible ways that life and or consciousness or something like that could exist within those universes, and then calculate the fraction of those universes compared to the total number of possible universes. Now, nobody does this. Religious people who want to argue that fine-tuning is evidence for God don't do this. Physicists and cosmologists who want to argue that the multiverse is necessary to explain things don't do this. Nobody does this because it's wildly impractical. Our knowledge of all possible laws of physics isn't anywhere close to allowing us to make this argument. And the scientists are just as guilty of this as any of the theologians.
Well, I mean, that's the whole point of the fine-tuning argument, right? Which is that we don't have any sort of physical theory that can tell us why we have constants that take on these values in this particular way, and taken together, they have to be in a certain, they have to take certain values for any kind of life like you and I to ever evolve in the universe.
Not only that, but also consider, like, some people say, oh, well, we can explain it one day. It's like, okay, well, even if you did have a theory that could explain it, that's just going to push it back, right? It's like there's not, I know there's cosmological natural selection or like deeper physical laws objection, but like that's not going to solve fine tuning, right? That's just going to push the problem back, right? So I find it kind of interesting. And then not only that, but like fine tuning arguments don't even say that like it's likely that God would create a fine tuned universe, just that it's more likely than theism than its negation. It
doesn't even have to be probable at all on theism that we'd get this. It's just that in a comparative analysis, it strongly favors theism.
Right. So
okay, let's talk about, let's see, what else is he going to go through? Because we particularly want to go over why God's
base theorem.
It says basis theorem. That's funny. Go to that.
All right.
Theorem. Basis theorem is the way that we take our expectations for what should be true and update them on the basis of evidence that we attain about the universe. So what we mean is that we have some observations, some data, D, and we have a set of possible theories that might be true, T sub I, and then we define different ways of attaching probabilities to these theories being true. So P of X given Y is the probability that X is true once we have found out that Y is true. And then very crucially, we have the prior probability for a given theory. We need to say that not all theories are created equal. We give a larger prior probability to the theories that seem more powerful, more simple, more elegant. Theories that require a lot of special pleading and fine-tuning are given smaller prior probabilities. That's just the way that science works. And then basis theorem tells us that once we observe our data, the probability we assign to our theory being the right explanation for that data comes from taking the prior probability that theory was true before we got the data and then multiplying it by the probability that the data would be true in that theory. So if the theory is true, what's the chance that the data is going to happen? That is the probability the theory is true given that we've observed that data. And this is just a normalization factor on the bottom. So basically all this...
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying,
No, I wasn't going to dispute because I agree with what he's saying here. But
this is telling you the thing you need to keep in mind is that when we're judging our theories, we need to calculate two numbers. We need to calculate the likelihood that theory was right even before we looked at the universe. Then we have to update that likelihood by saying, now that we've looked at the universe, how does that probability change?
Yeah.
So let's apply this notion to both God and the multiverse, starting with the multiverse, the idea that in many different regions of space, laws of physics are very different. We find
Okay, so the first thing I want to push back is he's mentioning multiverse, but that doesn't preclude theism.
No.
You can have a multiverse if theism is true. So
Yeah.
this isn't even like you can't do a comparative analysis if the hypothesis you're comparing against doesn't conflate with theism, right?
Right.
Unless he wants to say that you have non-theism, so you have naturalism plus multiverse.
Right. So what's better to say here is not necessarily multiverse, but really, I guess it's like usually what they compare in the fine-tuning arguments is theism against chance.
Right.
And so, and they say, well, what's the likelihood of like a single universe naturalism, right? Like that's usually the theory. So on this one, it would be like, what's the probability like observe what we observe on multiverse naturalism, let's say, where you have a chancy mechanism, but instead of it only producing one universe, it's going to produce many universes. I think that's more accurately what we should be comparing it against. So let's just pretend as though that's what we're comparing it to.
ourselves only in the hospitable regions of space. So most people agree that the probability that life could exist, if the multiverse is true, is substantial. It is close to 1. If there really is a multiverse that is very, very big, that has all sorts of things going on, then somewhere there, life is going to be able to exist. And any people that are talking about this universe are going to exist in those little sub places where the life exists. That's more or less uncontroversial among people who are both pro and anti-multiverse. The controversy is on what prior probability we should give to this theory. This is our judgment on how good a theory the multiverse is in the first place. Should we penalize the idea of the multiverse because it is not simple, it is ontologically extravagant? You're imagining all of this stuff that you will never observe, even in principle, just to explain a few parameters in our little patch of observable universe. So this was put forcefully by Richard Swinburne, a theologian, who says to postulate a trillion other universes. A trillion is amusingly tiny compared to the actual number of universes that we generally do postulate. But to postulate a trillion other universes rather than one God in order to explain the orderliness of our universe seems the height of irrationality. So height of irrationality is a fanciful way of saying that the prior probability should be very, very small. Swinburne is saying, look, you're just postulating many unseen entities to explain one or two features of your observable world. That's not good science, is what he is saying. Of course,
I think that's a good interpretation of Swinburne coming in being like, what you got? Like, yeah, I think that's good.
This is that one does not postulate trillions of universes. That is not the way it works. The multiverse, and this is the crucial point, the multiverse is not a theory. The multiverse is not something that people sat around and said, hey, you know what would be neat is there were like 1 billion universes or 1 trillion or 10 to the 500 different universes. Wouldn't that be interesting? That is not how the idea came about. Rather, the multiverse is a consequence of other theories. So it's not that you postulate a bazillion different universes, it's that you postulate a small set of possible laws of physics. And these laws of physics predict the existence of many different universes. In the early 1980s, Vilenkin and Linde and others invented what we call eternal inflation. That if you believe inflation is possible, inflation is a very well-grounded physical scenario.
I don't think that's a good way to think, because if the data in question is this feature of the universe about strict parameters required for embodied moral agents to exist, because that's how proponents of the fine-tuning argument argue it, then I mean, when people try to explain it away, they say, well, what if there was all these other universes, and we find ourselves in one of those universes where the way that things branched out and unfolded, how these different regions of space-time diversified themselves, we find ourselves in the variant where life exists. I don't see how it's still getting around the fact that a multiverse is used as a way to show that the probability, either to match the probability of theism or to show that theism is an unnecessary explanation of fine-tuning, given that we can achieve it if we understand that there's going to be many regions of space-time with differing physics, right? I still think that I mean, that's what we see in the literature, right? Like the multiverse is defended as a hypothesis to explain the data, but in the epistemic sense, right?
Yeah.
Not in terms of I can grant that physicists get the multiverse as a consequence. Sure, I can grant that. But when it comes to at least the literature arguing against God in terms of fine tuning, they will, in the epistemic sense, argue that it's more epistemically likely that that if there is a multiverse, that you will have a particular universe like the one that we observe, where there are embodied moral agents. I mean, what do you think? I mean, isn't that how the literature kind of presents itself?
That's how. Well, yeah, but I think to be fair to Sean Carroll, I think what he's saying is like, these other like inflationary theories, because they entail a multiverse, then
Right.
the prior probability of the multiverse is going to be the probability of the inflationary theory that entails it. I think that's what he's trying to say. And then
Okay,
I
gotcha.
think what he also wants to say is that, well, the prior probability of these inflationary theories are not super low, as Swinburne wants to say. I think that's what he's trying to get
Okay,
at.
now that makes sense. And if that's the case, then yeah, then it's using our regular probability, our prior probability assessments on whether or not that's true. I think that even still with that fact, it's interesting when you read the literature on those that defend different models of the universe to
And I
combat a
think
solution
that's what
explanation.
Swinburne was getting at
Yeah.
in his response. He wasn't talking about, inflationary
Right,
theory.
and of course, pulling that text, that particular quote out of its entire context is not helpful.
Right. So
we don't know whether it's true or not, but a very plausible scenario for explaining the observed homogeneity and isotropy of the universe. What Vilenkin and Linde showed is that if you believe that, then in a wide swath of possible inflationary models, inflation never ends. It ends in some region of the universe, but elsewhere it keeps on going, and it keeps creating new regions of universe. It's not something that you need to put in. It very generically comes out of your attempt to explain the observed homogeneity of our universe. Then in the late 1990s, string theorists realized that as you go from 10 or 11 dimensions of space-time that string theory posits, down to the 4 that we know and love, you can do that. But if you can do it in one way, you can do it in 10 to the 500 different ways. And all of these different ways to compactify the hidden dimensions of space give us different low-energy laws of physics. This is called the string theory landscape. All sorts of different possible parameters that you can imagine getting, a huge, huge number of them. So string theory says that the laws of physics could be very different from place to place. Inflation says it's easy to physically create regions which actually have those laws. Now, both of these schemes are optional. We don't know that they are absolutely right. They're not established. But the point is that the number of things that you are postulating is not trillions of trillions. It's more like 2 or 3. You don't argue against statistical mechanics of the atmosphere in this room on the basis of, gee, you need a lot of molecules in this room to explain this. You don't count theories, you don't count against theories because of a number of elements in a certain set.
yes, okay, I agree with him on this point.
So yeah, I think, like you were saying, I think it's good that I don't think that Swinburne is really arguing against any of this. I think he's really arguing against people who literally posit a multiverse to explain away fine tuning, like who actually who try to just increase the amount of diversity of universes to do that. I think that's completely right. I think on this point though, I agree with him on how we should assess theoretical content. Right, we should do it in a syntactical way. Right. And we should do it in a way where we look at our fundamental postulates. If he's saying, yeah, my fundamental postulates are just 2 or 3 postulates, right? And then that can give me an explanation. Well, then, I mean, I think what's happening here is I think that when it comes to fine tuning, we're comparing theism against some particular form of naturalism, right? Which would be some just regular, like some physical theory. Okay, I have this physical theory over here, and that's going to explain it, and that's how we can do our comparative analysis. And at that point, right, well then, given our trope theoretic view, I think if you take that into account, right, we have one being with 0 kinds, 0 properties.
That's going to be the simplest view.
And then so it's even still going to have a greater priors than this view. So
yeah.
That the theory invokes. You don't say that the integers are ontologically extravagant because there's an infinite number of them. It's a simple pattern that generates all of the integers. There's only a small number of kinds of molecules of air in this room. There's only a small number of physical principles that underlie the multiverse.
Laser,
the way to judge
laser.
Yeah.
Yeah.
the likelihood of the multiverse scenario is just to judge the plausibility of inflation and string theory, or some different ways of getting the same kind of thing. But once you have these dynamical laws, you get the many, many, many different regions of the universe. You don't separately postulate them. They don't count as a strike against the theory. So I would conclude, so I don't know what the answer is here, that what we're trying to get here is what is P of multiverse? What is the a priori probability you should give on the possibility of a multiverse existing? I wouldn't say it's close to 1 necessarily, but I wouldn't say it's 1 over 10 to the 500 either. You don't decrease the probability every time you add a new universe. You decrease the probability, the conceptual complication of your theory every time you add a new idea. And by that measure, the multiverse might not be of order.
Yep.
Yeah.
Order almost probability 1, but it's not vanishingly unlikely either. It's something that's very sensible to consider. So now let's turn to God. What is the prior probability for God and the probability that God is true given the data? So I'm going to talk about the prior probability later. Let's talk about the probability that God is the best explanation of the data.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
That we see. Given that God exists, do we expect to see this kind of universe? So I have no trouble believing that if God exists, then life should exist. I am willing to grant the God theorists that the kinds of gods that we're talking about here are the kinds that would make it possible for us to exist. I don't think that is a difficulty. It's the other data, the data other than the fact that life exists, that gets God into trouble as a hypothesis. And this is a very, very difficult thing to do right. What we're trying to do here is ask ourselves the question, if we didn't know anything about the actual universe, but we had an
antecedent probability.
Right.
theory that says that there's this thing called God that created the universe, that cares about us human beings, that has a large or infinite amount of power and so forth, what do we expect the universe to be like? It's very hard to do this because God is a little vague, frankly. God does not make unambiguous predictions, and we know what the universe looks like, so we tend to say, well, God would do it just like that, just like we see the universe looking. But that is not at all fair. We need to answer as honestly as we possibly can, what would we expect the universe to look like if God were responsible for it? So my favorite example of this is the low entropy of the early universe. This was the subject of the last Oxford mini course on philosophy and cosmology, the arrow of time. In the modern conception of the arrow of time, we understand that the microscopic laws of physics are perfectly reversible, the same running forwards and backwards in time. But the reason why macroscopic physics has such a pronounced directionality is that there's a boundary condition in the early universe. It has a much, much lower entropy than it would if you, again, picked the universe randomly out of a hat. A lower entropy by a factor of about 10 to the minus 10 to the 120. So this is not a typo. So the cosmological constant is fine-tuned 1 part in 10 to the 120. This is 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 120.
So that's not even the data, though. Okay, I see what he's trying to do. He's showing these specific facts. He's kind of showing, hey, there are these specific. If you take the general fact, embodied moral agents, and we take the specific fact, it seems that it's more fine-tuned than it should be. Boy, do we have our response to this. Okay, so first I want to say that that Peter Van Inwagen's model of creation is called the disjunctive model of creation, is this idea that that God purposely keeps things open-ended when he creates things. So for example, God will say, let there be embodied moral agents, let there be an orderly universe, right? And then God steps back and he lets creation kind of co-participate in a chancy way to unfold in such a way where those outcomes are guaranteed, but how those outcomes come about is
random.
It's random. It's unspecified from the
like,
so God instantiates an initial.
For example, like think of how we humans came about. Well, we didn't have to come about through chimpanzees. We could have come about through lizards. Right.
Yeah, we could have evolved from a lizard line. Our common ancestor could have been some kind of ancient lizard, right? So I think this idea here is that that if you take a disjunctive model of creation, and you have this idea that God only specifies the initial world segment and lets things unfold in a chancy way where where we allow true randomness. There's a really good book on randomness called like Abrahamic.
I have it.
Considerations on randomness or whatever. Oh, you actually have the book? Yeah, the book is dope.
Somewhere up there.
Oh, it's
right here.
In it. Yeah, pull that out. Yeah, Abrahamic reflections on, what does it say?
Randomness and providence.
Yeah, and so the idea here is that we often think about God creating total kind of whole world states of affairs, but rather God aims at the world segment and the initial world segment and doesn't like that. And so the idea here is that, well, if the type here is orderly complex universe where he wants embodied moral agents, well, then you can have, I mean, nearly infinite tokens of how that type manifests itself, right? And one way it manifests itself is that the entropy at early times is lower than its natural by a factor of 10 to a very, very big number. It's enormously smaller than it needs to be to allow life. But the target was achieved, an orderly complex universe where the laws are strict rather than lax to allow for life to exist, right?
Yeah.
And so it's this idea that we can kind of take this idea of fine-tuning meaning it's just right to mean like there can be no variation. Rather, there is a finite range, but there's freedom within the range. But the range where life is life prohibiting range is much larger, right? So you can have freedom within the range. And it seems that Carroll wants to say that if God is to do this, there can be no degrees of freedom in the range. There can only be one, right? And he's going to say this is a counterexample of that, therefore it decreases probability. But then another question, Kyle, which is that, okay, let's just grant this specific fact, and let's say that this is a kind of rebutting defeater to this evidence for theism. How much, though? How much does this decrease the evidence of this being evidence for theism?
It
How
will
much
decrease it
is
a
this?
little bit, but not to the extent that he's doing.
It won't overturn it the other way.
Yeah.
I don't see how it would overturn it the other way. I think that if you did that, your probability assignments would be very unreasonable.
Right. So even if we grant him that, yeah, this specific fact disconfirms theism, it's not going to disconfirm by that much, right? Because you're still going to have the outcome space. Now, what would the outcome space? So, like, the outcome space of an orderly universe is still going to be, because it seems like low entropy still depends upon an orderly universe, and so the outcome space of that is going to be greater on theism, which means that, okay, yeah, that means the naturalist in this case gets a sliver of the outcome space. Let's say it's low entropy, but it's still going to be more likely on theism anyways, right? So notice how you did strategy 1, which is one I just mentioned, and then strategy 2, which is one that you mentioned, which is, well, we can antecedently, like if we use a disjunctive model, right? Then no, it's not evidence against theism, right? Because as long as God brings about life in some way, doesn't have to be any particular way, then it confirms, right? Then it confirms theism. So I don't know if is there anything else you want to say on this particular argument, or I don't really have much else to say.
It says that we'd have to conclude the probability of low entropy given theism is 10 to the minus 10 to the 1/20th. See, this is the problem with trying to put numbers on things.
Yeah.
Because
and not only that, but it also assumes that God would be interested in creating life at the very beginning, like the initial world segment that God creates includes life. Like why assume that to be the case?
Yeah.
So
I think these probability assignments are way off, to say the least.
Yeah.
So this is enormously more fine-tuning involved to explain the low numbers. And crucially, the cosmological constant, the vacuum energy, you can make the argument that if it were larger by a couple of orders of magnitude, that life would not exist. I'm not sure I buy that argument, but you could make that argument. For the entropy, however, that argument utterly fails. There is no sense whatsoever in which the entropy of the early universe needed to be that low just for life to exist. It could be enormously higher. It could be almost of order 1 compared to this, and we would still be fine. So if you really were trying to be consistent, I would argue that the probability that the entropy of the early universe could be that low given that God created the universe in order for us to be here, is of order 10 to the minus 10 to the 120.
So notice here, he says, if we claim that God is interested in allowing for life, but notice how what it should really be saying is God is interested in allowing for life at the initial world segment.
Yeah, right. You are 100% on that.
And the problem is, like, why think that the theist has to grant that antecedent judgment? If we say that God is interested in allowing for life at some time t, that's totally consistent with, like, the low entropy is not going to impact the probability at all, right?
Yeah, 100%.
See, I don't see any way for this argument to go through because, first of all, he's like, it depends on what you mean by God is interested in allowing for life. Does it mean it has to be the initial world segment, or could it be at some time? Because if we mean at some time, well, theism's not going to, low entropy is not going to do anything for that.
And I think there's a lot of things being assumed here, which is that he's saying what is, because he wants to go off of what's physically necessary for life. Like that God wouldn't go outside of the bounds of what's physical. So that's an assumption actually built in. It's not the fact that there's that the data here that he's pulling out of the background knowledge also must include the fact that that God's trying to aim at this at this physically necessary result where there's going to be no degrees of freedom about the low entropy state of the universe, right? That corresponds in a 1-to-1 to allowing life to exist. And so again, he's gonna have to factor that to get these probability assignments. So again, these probability assignments are off because we're gonna need more than this.
Right.
So that is big evidence against God. If we didn't know what the universe were really like, and we just said God created the universe in order for us to be here, we would predict.
No, because you have to be, if you go off a disjunctive model creation, then low entropy is totally consistent with life not existing at that stage.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
an early universe with enormously higher entropy. Another way of saying this is, here is the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. This is what you get when you point your camera at the sky and just take a picture. If your camera is attached to the Hubble Space Telescope, you see all of these little blobs, each one of which is a galaxy comparable in size to our Milky Way galaxy. So every one of these galaxies has billions of stars, of order 100 billion stars. There's 100 billion such galaxies in the universe. None of them are necessary for us to exist here on Earth.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Cool. That doesn't affect the argument. It doesn't affect fine-tuning at all. So,
No claims.
Oh man.
What else did he say? Do you think? Let's see.
Yeah.
If you were just going to make the universe and you were going to solve fine-tuning problems enough for life to exist, there's no reason to make any of these galaxies. All of the matter, all the degrees
let me.
of freedom in those galaxies should be in thermal equilibrium. If you're going to claim that your explanation for fine-tuning is that God made it that way in order for life to exist, you strongly predict that this should be blank.
Okay, so this is the argument from scale.
Oh man, it somehow found a way to get to us. I thought that we had escaped this, but
man, this is the yeah. So basically what he's saying is, well, we expect God to create life. Therefore, the thing we would expect is for God to only create our world, like our one planet, and like all these other planets, all these other stars shouldn't exist. I mean, that's basically what Carroll is trying to say here.
Yeah. Was it Nicholas Everett or Fales that came up with the argument for scale? Which one was it?
Nicholas Everett. I have his book.
Yeah. Well, Everett said it better anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, Sean predicts that this is blank. Okay, we have a lot of thoughts on this, but let's go ahead and let's just take it back to our principles, right? What do we have?
Yeah.
We have the UGP, we have ART, and then we have diffusiveness, and we have the plenitude. And basically, what this means is that we need all these principles. We can call them antecedent principles if we're going to understand what theism strongly predicts, right? So we're going to say that, well, is God satisfying? Is the nature of the being posited here being satisfied by the data that we observe, right? Or is it intentional with the data that we're being observed? So, for example, with the axiological relevance thesis, this is our theistic guide to confirmation. So we're going to say that, well, if we are to take some observation and we're to say that it confirms theism, there needs the relation that obtains between theism and the observation needs to be one of axiological relevance, which means that if that's going to be, there needs to be some kind of property of value, or there needs to be some valuable feature of the reality that we take into account. Well, there's a lot of aesthetic reasons that we can take into account, right? There are epistemic reasons we can take into account. A larger universe is a more universe for us to discover, to explore. Good job for bringing up the presentation. A universe for us to explore. A more beautiful universe, right, is one that's larger than one that just only contains our world, right? There are these things that there are alethic and aesthetic reasons that we can pull out to basically to derive this relation of axiological relevance. So that will always be antecedently more likely than theism's negation. So that is satisfied there. Then we have the UGP, right? Which is that, well, for any S can be instantiated by God if only if S permanently bears the axiological status of being good on the whole at some time t, right? Is that being violated here? Well, obviously not, right?
Yeah.
So that there's no problem there. And of course, diffusiveness, right? God is going to, and this ties right in line with the plenitude principle, which is that God isn't going to arbitrarily stop. It's kind of like the internal inflation idea that he's talking about, which is that internal inflation isn't just going to arbitrarily stop. It's going to have maybe some dead ends, but it's going to keep going, right? And God's the same way, except God's going to do this in a very loving way, that because love is uncompromising and love is not discriminate. God is going to indiscriminately manifest his goodness in all possible directions, and therefore it's going to be a manifestation of himself, because God is supposed to be the locus of what loving goodness is, right? Especially given our understanding of divine simplicity. So the idea here is that, well, of course, a complex orderly universe, one that's fine-tuned, is going to be one that's very large, right? Because not only are you going to get you have the aesthetic domain, you have all the other domains, the moral and the alethic domain being satisfied there. And so I think that what you have in this scenario is, I think that we have all three domains greatly being satisfied. A large universe, so much universe to discover and to explore and to find truth about. One that it's hard pressed to not trigger a sense of awe and wonder and beauty. And then one that's not filled with unique moral value, such as the fact that there are agents that can reason about good and bad and that can set up moral communities to help their fellow man. Like, these are all things satisfied within a large universe. So I don't think that the fact that we take into fine-tuning into account, that it's going to lower the probability of theism relative to that data, because there are other galaxies that don't contain life, or there are other galaxies that aren't needed or aren't necessary, physically necessary for the existence. Well, actually, that can even be debated, but are just necessary for the existence of us. So I think that I think what Carroll needs to do is he needs to overturn, I think we can overturn Carroll's antecedent judgments about what theism predicts through our posterior observations and using the axiological relevance thesis to do that.
I have nothing else to add.
Yeah, thanks for the slides.
Yeah. I just want people to know what we're talking about. Let me share my screen again so we can get back to the video. But yeah, I mean, so yeah, I guess the main issue here is, like, there's no reason to accept Carroll's antecedent judgments here. So that's all I really have to say on that. But
Let's keep going. We're almost done.
Yep.
Or at least just a chaotic mess. It should not have all these other galaxies in there. And I know that many religious believers would look at a picture like this and go, oh my goodness, the glory and stupendousness of God's creation. I look at a picture like this and say, how in the world can you think that the reason for this is to let us be here? We are very tiny compared to a very big universe.
So that I wouldn't even say that. I think that our model of theism would say that the universe is actually created to fulfill all the domains of value. God created the universe not just for moral reasons, like for moral agents, but also for aesthetic reasons, to have a beautiful canvas of diverse states of affairs to obtain. So I don't think that, but I mean, what fine tuning does Luke Barnes ever argue that God fine tuned the universe, that everything exists only for us? I don't think Luke Barnes or Robin Collins or Swinburne has ever argued that on print. So
yeah.
So there's of course responses to this kind of argument. People have thought of it. They say, well, maybe you can't make us. Maybe you can't form our solar system without forming all those other galaxies and so forth. This is just false. Everything we know about physics tells us that none of those other galaxies is necessary to explain what we have in our neighborhood here. So you say, well, maybe the reason why you get all those other galaxies of this really lower entropy than you ever needed is because God is sort of procedurally thrifty. God does not just make, so remember, it's God we're talking about. God would have no trouble making just the Milky Way if that's what God chose to do. But you might say, well, God wants to play by his own rules, so God plays by the laws of physics, so God makes use of some physical mechanism for universe creation, which as a byproduct of making conditions that allow for us to exist, also make 100 billion other galaxies. So that is plausible, but you see what's happening. You see that by trying to explain this feature that we would not have predicted, we are pushed to create essentially physical, naturalistic, scientific explanation. We are removing all of the usefulness from God. We're saying that the reason why the universe looks like that is because there's some physical mechanism that makes it look like that, and that's what God used. But that's a story I can tell without invoking God at all. There's a physical mechanism that made the universe look like this, and then I can just stop.
So this is a very Oppian line of reasoning, right? That we can just subtract God, keep the physical, keep that explanation. But the problem is that if we're talking in terms of epistemic probability here, it doesn't make it more likely once you remove God. Once you introduce inexplicability, right? Because it's going to be a brute fact. It's going to be inexplicable why the parameters of physics, why the laws of physics unfold in this way to create these, to instantiate these phenomena, right? And the idea,
especially if you consider that explanation guides confirmation.
Well, right, and especially if we consider as well axiology, right? That if we can look out into the world and we can actually find properties of value, right, features of value about the state of affairs that we observe, then it's going to be epistemically more likely on theism that God would, in this disjunctive way, employ a chancy mechanism which just involves the initial, the properties of the initial world segment. But it's not going to be epistemically more likely on naturalism or the negation of theism if you just keep the mechanism, right? Because the idea here is, well, the universe just has this disposition to unfold in this way. But no, what theism is doing is explaining to you why the disposition is here, because there's value not only in God creating this way, but there's value, but there's also this idea that we can, through our antecedent principles, show that it is probable that it would go this way, right? Hence the disjunctive model of creation, hence plenitude and all that other thing. So
now I want to, let me just share my screen real quick. I'll do this very, very briefly, just so that people can understand. So it seems like Sean Carroll's is using a weak version of the parity method, which is natural dispositions, right? So let me just open up so people can see what I'm talking about. So you mentioned Oppie's parity method, but I feel like Sean Carroll is actually using a weaker version of Malpass's own stalking horse objection. And what's interesting is that doesn't work on our, when we apply this kind of, when we apply our explanatory framework. And the reason why is because natural dispositions cannot link naturalism in the same way that axiology connects to theism, right? This is like a weaker form of what Malpass is trying to do, right? But I would say that like Sean Carroll's argument, what he's saying here, is basically like the same as what Alex Malpass has tried to do in the past, which is try to parrot the explanation based on natural dispositions, right? So notice how Sean Carroll was talking about how, well, you just subtract God and you're just left with, the physical mechanisms of the universe. That's no different than just saying, oh, well, I'm just going to subtract God and just have natural dispositions.
Yeah.
That's, you're running into the same problems, right? Yeah. It's not going to help you. It's not going to help your naturalism if you remove God from the picture, right? So,
absolutely, yeah.
That's what I would say. But anyways, I'll stop sharing my screen now.
No, that was good that you said that. Yeah.
All right. I think now we should get through the entire video after this. Unless there's anything else from our presentation we should add.
Yeah, let's keep going.
The advantage that you might have had in invoking God in the first place has gone away. This kind of argument that a priori you would not have expected the entropy of the early universe to be so low if God were the explanation is the same kind of argument that has been used to argue against God for millennia now. The probability that if God really exists, the world wouldn't look like that is what we're talking about. This is the problem of evil. If God existed, we wouldn't expect there to be evil. This is the problem of random suffering. Even if you argue that evil is necessary for free will and human choice and so forth, there's no reason to, have natural disasters strike down innocent children or anything like that. God could prevent that from happening. It's not what you would expect a priori. My favorite is the problem of instructions. If I didn't know what the universe were like, but I thought that the universe were designed and created by a caring, omnipotent God who wanted us to do well, the first prediction I would make would be that God would explain himself to us very clearly. As a textbook author who has read his Amazon.com reviews, I would expect God's textbook to be perfectly clear. It might not be easy to follow the instructions, but I would know what the instructions were. It would have been very easy for God in some holy scripture to give us some clues, to say, matter is made of atoms. The universe is billions of years old. People of different races and sexes and genders and sexual orientations should be treated equally. Governments should derive their power from the consent of the government. A whole bunch of things that God could have told us and chose not to. That's a prediction that I would have made otherwise.
Okay, so
this is like a problem of divine hiddenness in a sense.
I actually think it's different. So my response to this would be that I think if it's a valuable thing for us to discover what he just mentioned, so he mentioned a lot of these different things. I don't want to go over.
Okay, so it's epistemic.
Yeah, so he mentioned all these facts and like, oh well, I would expect God to just tell me this. But it's like it's not clear to me why that's the case, because you could easily say that, well, God wants me to discover these things, so God wouldn't give me all these instructions, or God wouldn't give me these list of propositions that are true, that I actually have to go out and figure it out on myself, right? You have that sort of alethic good of building moral, building your knowledge of the world, and that itself is expected on theism, given that it has actually logical relevance, right?
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Is there something valuable we can learn? Because he's doing the same thing that remember I told you that one thing that a lot of atheologians do is they have to rely on this kind of a priori prediction, because once the moment they can allow for us to make a posteriori considerations about what God would do is the moment in which axiology rolls itself into the room and makes everything clear, right? And so Carroll has to, not in the sense that he's doing this in a malicious way, but in a sense that he sees something that's clear to him about how we should do this comparative analysis, or how we can say that theism makes predictions. But in a sense, I think that that we can help shine the light of reason on what Carroll is missing. And I think there's something valuable that Carroll is missing, which is the idea that all these antecedent judgments that we can make about theism, when we bring in these other principles like ART and the UGP, we can actually overturn and update these antecedent principles through our posterior observations. And we can go, okay, this makes sense. We can learn about what theism predicts based on the value that we find. And we know that minimally, God, anything of value has prima facie allure to God. And so if we find that it's valuable that we learn these things and we wrestle with these things, right, then we just identified a reason as to why God desired and was motivated for this particular thing to obtain, or why he operates these particular states of affairs to obtain in such a way. So I think that we can shine a light on that. And once we do that, we can have a more comprehensive picture about what theism predicts. And this isn't just making up stuff. This isn't just having auxiliary hypotheses, or this isn't ad hoc, right? Our whole entire presentation on Cameron Pertuzzi's channel shows that this is a framework for thinking about theistic prediction.
Right.
Nice. Finally, I like to say it. This is one way I like to say it. Imagine you're a theologian in a world where there wasn't evil or random suffering, and where God had given perfectly clear instructions. There were holy scriptures that said, be nice to each other, blah, 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 blah. If you were that theologian, would you take the absence of injustice in the world as evidence against the existence of God?
No.
Well, So notice how he's talking about injustice. What he's talking about is unjustified suffering. So I actually would say that unjustified evils is evidence against God, but like he can't just go from there's suffering, therefore there's unjustified suffering. Like that doesn't
So,
logically follow.
so wait, replay this clip again because I took a different interpretation of what you just said.
Okay.
Blah, blah, blah. If you were that theologian, would you take the absence of injustice in the world as evidence against the existence of God?
Okay, yeah, so that's what I thought. So what he's saying is if evil can be explained by theism, then if we live in a world where there's no evil, does that mean theism still explains that? That's what he's saying.
Yeah.
And I would say, well, yeah, it still explains that. Because there's still value, right? We're not saying that the only viable state of affairs that could ever exist is that there is justifiable evil. It's also a good state of affairs if there is no evil, right? Well,
Yeah.
but to show that this isn't predicted by theism, right? What would we have to show? Well, one, we have to violate the UGP. It would have to be a world kind of like what Swan Sonna said, where like a bunny rabbit comes into existence, suffers for
Yeah.
1,000 years, and dies, and never, and that's its existence altogether. Like that would be a world in which theism is just not true. So I think that that again, I understand. I think the exercise that he's doing is very clever here. Right? Is it, oh, if we do the opposite, right? Is it still evidence for and against theism?
Yeah.
It's like, well, we're still dealing with value, and theism predicts value.
So one of the things is that, and this is often missed in discussions, is that, and I think, oh yeah, Trent Dowdery also told me this, which is that theistic predictions are multiply realizable, which basically means that there are multiple ways that things can be evidence for theism. And there's multiple even random ways for God to bring things about, right? Taking a disjunctive model, right? So as long as you have a world that doesn't violate the antecedent probability judgments, then yeah, I mean, it's not evidence against theism, right? So
Exactly.
All right, let's continue.
I think you would not. I think you go, well, this is what I would expect God to do. He made a just society for us. If you wouldn't count the absence of injustice as evidence against the existence of God, then you should count.
So I'm counting, what we're counting against the existence of God is unjustified suffering.
Yes, exactly.
But the issue is we have no clear indication that there is unjustified suffering.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's all I have to say on that. If
No,
there's
okay.
yep.
The presence of injustice as evidence against the existence of God. There's a couple of ways to salvage the idea that God would have made the data like this. One is to just erase God's fingerprints everywhere, to say, you know what God really likes to do? Act like God doesn't exist. God likes to obey the laws of physics. Again, that's possible, but then you're removing the usefulness of God. And the other strategy is vagueness, to deny that we have any reason to expect anything of God, to deny that we can make predictions for what the universe
I wouldn't do
would be
that.
like.
Count me out on that. Yeah, no, yeah. Anybody who says he can't make predictions about what God will do, I'm
Yeah. Yeah. Same here.
So I have a quote here from Terry Eagleton. He's first trying to say that God is the condition of possibility, the answer to why there's something rather than nothing, very abstract, ethereal sounding concept. But then he likes to say, well, God can have regrets. God is an artist who does things out of love, and therefore you can't predict what God is going to do.
Okay, yeah, I don't agree with that.
right, yeah.
Let me skip to the multiverse. This is the last thing.
Here we go.
Yep.
About the multiverse are predicting the relic density of dark matter axions in the universe on the basis of the multiverse hypothesis. I don't especially believe this is a reliable prediction in any sense, but at least they are trying. I've never seen a picture like this in a theology journal. No one ever tries to use the God hypothesis. They can try to claim credit for the low vacuum energy that allows us to exist. No one ever tries to calculate the predicted density of axions under the God theory.
No one ever tries to use universals or tropes to explain that graph. So therefore, we shouldn't at all put any stock or weight with whether or not universals or tropes exist. And that can go for any metaphysical theory on the table, right? I think that's a problem. It's like, well, no, God isn't a physical explanation. God is not a scientific explanation. God is not an explanation in terms of within the workings of the laws of nature, right?
You can even do that against like existential inertia.
Yeah, something,
Like,
something that even help naturalism, right? Exactly.
yeah.
We're talking about a metaphysical thesis. You can't say that because something is in a completely different category, metaphysical thesis. Therefore, because we have a physical thesis that it invalidates it. It's like no. The metaphysical thesis helps color the palette of explanation or illuminates the facts that we obtain through science, right? So of course, no, theology is a completely different field. We wouldn't say that. I mean, it's just trying to combine fields, right? It's like we're saying, like,
Yeah.
literature has its own theories, psychology has its own theories. But to say that, well, we don't find these ideas
Yeah, I
in
don't say
psychology,
psychology. Yeah, talking about cosmology.
right? A
Or
complete
history or
category error.
whatever. Yeah.
So that is my conclusion, which is that as ontologically extravagant as the multiverse seems to be, God is much more problematic. It's a whole separate category. It's not a kind of physics, a kind of natural process. It's a whole other kind.
Well, that's actually not technically true if we take trope theory.
Right.
Because God would be a token of the type within trope theory, and trope theory is used within quantum field theory.
Yeah, as an ontological basis for the things that are being studied in it. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So that's actually not true what he's saying here. Yeah, I don't. If anything else you want to add?
No, not really.
All right.
Kind of thing. It is ill-defined, unnecessary as far as I can tell, and seemingly you need to sort of take or leave different predictions that you.
So it's interesting that he thinks well, I guess this is his last argument, which is like theism is ill-defined. Swinburne has written a whole book defining what theism is.
Yeah.
Talking about how it's coherent. So that's just not true either.
Yeah, literally. I have that
might
book.
make depending on how they fit. It's on the table as a logical possibility. I think as good scientists, we've learned over the last few hundred years that we can do better in explaining the universe. Thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's very weird. We have decent scientific theories for explaining physical phenomena, but that's not the type of theory that God is.
Yeah.
But because God explains metaphysical data, it's the metaphysical
Right.
data that God is explaining, right? For example, okay, sure, the universe tells us that particles exist. The thing that theism is explaining isn't the existence of particles. It's explaining that the particles are contingent. That's a metaphysical feature of particles. It's explaining grounding layers, that we have these layers of grounding. It's the metaphysical data of grounding layers that theism is explaining. It's explaining the causal finitism, right? It's explaining the fact that the nature of reality is that over any entity's history, that entity's history cannot extend infinitely far into the past, right? It's all metaphysical data, right? So it's not. It's very weird to say what Sean is saying if that's the case, right? But I think that again, right, we're not attacking Sean as a person or any of his credentials. I think he's an amazing physicist. He does really well at what he does. But I think that some of these more fundamental things are either just misunderstandings or mistakes. And really, we're just kind of here to kind of clear up these ideas using what we've learned over time. And I think what we have to offer here, I think we can provide value for what Sean is saying. And hopefully, some more robust, intelligent theists. I would still love to see a conversation between him and Rob Coons. Because I think that would just be an amazing conversation. But Ben Watkins actually thinks that that's never going to happen. That Sean would never do it. But it's one of my dreams. I can dream.
Anything else you have to say?
No, what do you got?
Nothing else. I mean, there were some things that I did agree with him on. So for example, like I agree with him that like if we're gonna say that theism can't make any predictions, I think that's wrong. I agree with him that we should be talking about empirical data. So, not just sitting down and like, thinking about things, but you actually want to go out and observe things theism makes predictions. We want to judge theism based on as a theory, right? Judge it as a theory, not just as some idea. But everything else, let's just say it was, what's the right word? It was a dumpster fire.
Yeah, very, very interesting stuff that he's saying, but I'm glad we were able to express our thoughts.
Yeah. All right. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for watching, and have a nice day.
Peace out, guys.